Hey everyone, tonight we are stepping back into a world where the horizon doesn't just glow with the sunrise, but with the terrifying rhythmic shimmer of 10,000 scales of polished steel. Imagine you are standing on a dusty ridge in the Anatolian highlands during the height of the 10th century. The air is crisp, the smell of wild thyme is thick, and then you hear it a low, rhythmic thrumming that vibrates in your marrow. Out of the morning haze, a line of riders appears. But these aren't just men on horses. They are statues of iron, reflecting the light so intensely, it's like looking directly into a furnace. Every inch of the rider is encased in metal, and as they draw closer, you realize the horses are mirror images of their masters, draped in steel blankets that drape down to their knees. It is a sight so heavy, so improbable, that it feels like a glitch in the medieval timeline. To be honest, if you were standing there with nothing but a leather shield and a spear, you probably would unsurvive the next 5 minutes. You'd be less of a combatant and more of a speed bump for a 3/4 engine of war. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. So go ahead and drop your location and your local time in the comments. It's always surreal to see how far these stories travel while we all tucked away in our own corners of the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You breathe in the cold mountain air, watching the condensation rise from your breath, but your eyes are locked on that advancing line. This is the Byzantine cataphract, the ultimate evolution of the Roman war machine. To understand why these men looked like they stepped out of a sci-fi novel, you have to look at the sheer physics of their existence. You aren't looking at a scout or a light raider. You are looking at the Byzantine Empire's total war button. These riders, the cataphractoi, were the response to a world that had become increasingly obsessed with arrows. In the East, the primary threat wasn't a broadsword to the face, it was the relentless, stinging rain of composite bow fire from the steppes. Historians still argue whether the Byzantine version of this heavy cavalry was a direct imitation of the Persian savran, or if it was an organic Roman evolution. But as you watch them move, the lineage doesn't matter as much as the sheer presence. You notice that the rider's face is completely obscured by a mail coif, leaving only 2 dark circles for eyes. This wasn't just for protection, it was psychological warfare. You aren't fighting a man, you're fighting an icon. The horse beneath the rider is a massive creature, specifically bred for this burden. It's wearing a klibanion, for horses a multi-piece set of bronze or iron scales, stitched to a thick leather or felt backing. The weight is the first thing that hits you. A fully equipped cataphract and his horse could be carrying upwards of 160 pounds of equipment alone, not counting the rider's own body weight. One mainstream historical fact that often gets lost is that the Byzantines didn't just use this armor for show. It was part of a very specific tactical manual called the Precepta Militaria. This wasn't a chaotic charge like you see in the movies. It was a slow, walking wall of metal. They would approach at a steady trot, maintaining a perfect gapless line. Because if a horse tripped or a gap opened, the invincibility shattered. But here's a quirky tidbit you might not know. Beneath all that iron, the rider is likely wearing a garment of pure silk. It sounds delicate, right? Like they're headed to a gala after the massacre. But the Byzantines discovered that if an arrow did manage to pierce the mail and the lamellar, the silk wouldn't break. Instead, it would wrap around the arrow tip and be pushed into the wound. This meant that when the camp medic went to remove the arrow, they could just gently pull on the silk fabric, and the arrowhead would come out cleanly without the barbs tearing the flesh. It was the high-tech medical tech of the year 950. As you watch the unit halt, the sound of jingling mail is like 1,000 wind chimes made of knives. The horse's armor, or the barding, is what truly separates this unit from anything else in the Mediterranean. Why cover the horse? Because an unarmored horse is a giant target. The enemies of the empire, the Arabs, the Bulgars, the Pechenegs knew that if you kill the horse, the rider becomes a very expensive, very slow-moving turtle on the ground. By arming the horse, the Byzantines created a tank that was virtually immune to the light archery of the day. You see the sunlight catch the prometopidion, the metal plate protecting the horse's forehead. It's engraved with a cross, a reminder that this isn't just a military exercise, it's a holy defense of the god-guarded city of Constantinople. The sheer expense of this setup is mind-boggling. to equip just one of these riders, an entire middle-class estate's yearly output might be required. You're looking at the Ferraris of the Middle Ages. If Ferraris were covered in spikes and carried 4-meter-long lances, as the sun rises higher, the heat begins to radiate off the metal plates. You can see the slight shimmer of heat distortion rising from the rider's shoulders. It's a claustrophobic existence. Inside that helmet, the rider's world is reduced to a narrow field of vision and the sound of their own heavy breathing. Every movement is deliberate. You notice a rider adjust his grip on the contos, a massive spear that requires 2 hands to level effectively. Because they didn't have the high-backed saddles of later Western knights, the cataphract relied on sheer core strength and balance to stay mounted during the impact. The horse shifts its weight, its metal skirts clanking against its legs. The animal is remarkably calm, a testament to years of desensitization. A normal horse would bolt at the sound of its own armor, let alone the screams of a battlefield. But these horses were trained to thrive in the noise. There's a persistent debate among scholars about whether these horses were truly as slow as the records suggest, or if they were capable of a terrifying short-distance gallop that could flatten a shield wall in seconds. You take a step back as the line begins to move again. The sheer mass of it is intimidating. It's not just about the damage they do. It's about the fact that they are still there, standing, after you've emptied your quiver at them. It's a relentless, grinding form of warfare. The Byzantines knew that the appearance of invulnerability was often more effective than the actual steel. You watch the dust rise around their hooves, muffled by the heavy felt padding beneath the horse's metal scales. This is the beginning of our deep dive into the Iron Tide, where we'll look at the smiths who hammered these plates, the farmers who fed these beasts, and the emperors who spent the wealth of provinces just to keep these iron men in the saddle. The iron wall you see before you didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was forged through centuries of Roman stubbornness and a very painful learning curve. To understand why you are looking at a horse draped in more metal than a modern luxury car, you have to realize that the Romans actually started out hating heavy cavalry. In the early days of the Republic, if you were a Roman soldier, you relied on your own 2 feet and a very large shield. Cavalry was something you hired other people to do. But as the empire pushed east, they ran headfirst into the Parthians, and later the Sassanid Persians, who had perfected the art of the Savronobile riders clad in mail from head to toe. You can imagine the shock of the traditional Roman legionary, standing there in his sandals, watching a line of silver-clad giants trot toward him, seemingly indifferent to the pilum thrown their way. It was a slow, agonizing transition. You see, the Romans were like that friend who refuses to upgrade their phone until it literally stops working. They clung to their infantry-focused tactics until the sheer effectiveness of the armored horsemen became impossible to ignore. After the disastrous Battle of Carrhae, where Roman legions were essentially turned into pincushions by Persian horse archers and then finished off by heavy lances, the memo finally arrived in Rome. They needed their own tanks. By the time of the Emperor Hadrian, the first units of klibanion, a name that literally translates to kill men because of how hot it got inside the armor, started appearing in the Roman rolls. Historians still argue whether there was a functional difference between a cataphractorius and a klibanius, or if the terms were just used interchangeably by bored scribes. But the result was the same: more metal. As you watch these Byzantine riders, you are seeing the version 2.0 of that Roman experiment. By the 4th and 5th centuries, the western half of the empire was crumbling under the weight of Germanic migrations. But in the east, the part we now call Byzantium, the money was still flowing, and the threats were getting heavier. The Byzantine cataphract became the ultimate synthesis of Roman discipline and Eastern hardware. One mainstream historical fact that underscores this evolution is the influence of the Emperor Julian the Apostate. Despite his complicated reputation, he was one of the first to really formalize the use of these heavy units in the Roman army. Even though he reportedly found the sight of them somewhat grotesque and alien to the Roman spirit, they looked like moving statues, rigid and mechanical. But you can't argue with results. As the centuries rolled on and the empire transitioned from Latin-speaking Rome to Greek-speaking Byzantium, the cataphract became the undisputed king of the battlefield. Here's a quirky tidbit. The term cataphract actually comes from the Greek kataphractos, which means completely enclosed, and they took that completely very seriously. There are accounts of Persian cataphracts, the cousins of the men you are looking at, who were so tightly sewn into their armor that they could uneven bend their knees to mount their horses. They had to be hoisted into the saddle by assistants. Imagine the dignity of being a legendary warrior, but needing a Twillman lift just to get onto your ride. The Byzantines, being a bit more practical, refined this. They made the armor modular. You see the way the shoulder guards, or humerales, are laced to the main chest piece. That allowed for the range of motion needed to actually swing a mace or a sword once the lance was shattered. As you walk along the line of stationary riders, you notice how they resemble a collection of different cultures. Their helmets have a distinctly Persian flair. Their shields are sometimes shaped like kites, anticipating the Norman style. And their boots are thick, reinforced leather. They were the original special forces, drawing the best technology from every enemy they defeated. It's a fascinating bit of irony. The Byzantines survived for 1,000 years because they were the world's best copycats. If a group of nomads showed up with a better bow, the Byzantines stole the design. If the Persians had better horse armor, the Byzantines built a factory to mass produce it. The horse armor you're staring at the barding was the final piece of the puzzle. Early Roman heavy cavalry often left the horse's belly and chest exposed, which was a huge mistake when facing infantry who were more than happy to crawl under the horse and start stabbing. You see the lareca equina on the horse in front of you. It's a massive skirt of scale mail that hangs almost to the animal's fetlocks. It's not just for show. It turns the horse into a battering ram that is immune to the low-level chaos of a melee. But why go this far? Why make the horse suffer under 40 or 50 kilograms of iron? Because by the 7th century, the empire was fighting for its life against the rapid expansion of the Arab caliphates. The desert raiders were fast, agile, and masters of the hit and run. The Byzantine answer was to become unhittable. You can T-hit and run against a wall that does unfeel your arrows and can crush your light cavalry through sheer mass. It was an arms race, plain and simple. Every time an enemy found a way to pierce the armor, the Byzantines added another layer of felt, or changed the angle of the steel scales. There's an open scholarly debate about the Romanness of these troops. Some purists argue that once the army stopped fighting in the classic testudo infantry formations and moved to these armored horsemen, they ceased to be Roman in the traditional sense. But if you asked the rider behind that steel mask, he'd tell you in Greek that he is a Romeos, a Roman. To him, this armor isn't a departure from tradition. It's the pinnacle of it. It's the survival of the state through superior engineering. You notice a young squire running between the horses, checking the leather straps that hold the barding in place. The maintenance was a nightmare. In the humidity of the coast or the dust of the interior, rust was a constant enemy. Every single one of those thousands of scales had to be oiled and checked for cracks. If a single strap snapped during a charge, the horse might trip over its own armor, turning a terrifying weapon of war into a very heavy, very loud pile of scrap metal. The sun is higher now, and the glare off the unit is actually starting to hurt your eyes. It's a literal wall of light. This was the Iron Age in its most literal, concentrated form. You aren't just looking at soldiers, you are looking at the accumulated wealth, metalworking, and tactical genius of a millennium of Roman history, all sitting on the back of a very tired, very strong horse. This legacy of heavy metal wasn't just about protection, it was about permanence. The empire might be shrinking, but as long as these men were in the field, the heart of Rome still beat behind a chestplate of steel. The sun is climbing higher over the Anatolian plains, and you're restarting to realize that being a cataphract is less of a job and more of an endurance sport. You watch as a rider prepares for the day, and the sheer labor involved in just getting dressed is enough to make you want to go back to bed. This isn't like throwing on a hoodie and heading out. This is a systematic, multi-layered engineering project. First, the rider pulls on a thick quilted tunic of cotton or coarse silk. It looks comfy enough until you realize it's nearly an inch thick, designed to act as a shock absorber. Without this, the steel plates would chafe your skin raw, or worse. Transmit the blunt force of a mace blow directly into your ribs. You probably wouldn't survive a single skirmish if you went into battle with just the metal. It's the soft layers underneath that actually keep your bones from splintering. Next comes the laricion, a shirt of fine chainmail that reaches down to the thighs. You see the rider struggle slightly as the weight, roughly 25 pounds of interlocking iron rings, settles onto his shoulders. But he's not done, not even close. Over the mail, his squires help him lift the klibanion, the iconic Byzantine lamellar cuirass. This is a rigid vest made of hundreds of small, rectangular steel plates, or lamellae, laced together with leather thongs. Unlike the muscle cuirass of the ancient Greeks, this armor moves with the body, but it feels like wearing a heavy metallic corset that refuses to let you take a full, deep breath. The clinking sound is constant, a metallic rustle that accompanies every shrug of the shoulders. One mainstream historical fact that hits home during this process is that the Byzantine military was one of the first to implement standardized equipment sizes. While it wasn't exactly small-medium, large at your local mall, the military workshops in Constantinople followed strict templates to ensure that parts could be replaced in the field. This was the birth of the military-industrial complex. You watch as the rider fastens his humeralia, those heavy, padded spalders that guard the shoulders. In this era, a downward sword stroke from a light cavalryman was a common threat, and these guards were designed to deflect that energy away from the neck. Here as a quirky tidbit to chew on, to prevent the armor from overheating or rattling too much. Many cataphracts wore a lightweight linen or silk surcoat over the metal. These were often dyed in brilliant regimental colors, deep blues, vibrant reds, or regal purples. So, while they looked like iron statues, they also looked like a very dangerous parade. But the silk served a dual purpose. It kept the direct sun off the metal. Without that thin layer of fabric, the steel would absorb the heat so effectively that the rider would literally begin to cook inside his own kit. Historians have often joked that a cataphract was just a very expensive, human-shaped slow cooker. As the rider sits on a bench to have his greaves, the podopsiala strapped to his shins. You notice the complexity of the leg protection. They aren't just solid metal shins. They are often splinted armor, strips of steel riveted to thick leather. This allowed the rider to actually bend his ankles so he could use his stirrups effectively. And speaking of stirrups, they are the unsung heroes of this entire setup. Without them, the rider would be a decorative ornament. With them, he is a braced, unstoppable force. There is an open scholarly debate regarding just how much the weight of this armor limited the cataphract's utility. Some historians argue that they were so encumbered they were only useful for a single devastating charge, while others point to records of cataphracts engaging in prolonged skirmishes and even chasing down lighter opponents. You watch the rider stand up, testing his weight. He moves with a heavy, deliberate gait, like a deep-sea diver on dry land. His center of gravity has completely shifted. Every step requires a conscious effort of the core and thighs. It's a physical burden that requires the rider to be in peak athletic condition. A dad bod simply wouldn't last 10 minutes in a klibanion. Then there's the helmet. The rider lifts a deep, conical bowl of steel with a long aventala curtain of mail attached to the rim. When he pulls it on, his humanity vanishes. The mail covers his nose, mouth, and neck, leaving only his eyes visible. It's a claustrophobic, muffled world in there. You hear him speak to his squire, and the voice sounds like it's coming from the bottom of a well. This facial protection was vital because the cataphract's primary job was to lead the charge into a cloud of arrows. Protecting the eyes and the throat was the difference between a successful career and a very short, very painful retirement. Finally, he pulls on his gloves leather, reinforced with scales on the back of the hand. You notice he still has enough dexterity to grip his sword hilt, but the fine motor skills are gone. He can't easily tie a knot or pick up a coin. He has become a tool of purely industrial-scale violence. The total weight of the man, the undergarments, the mail, the lamellar, the greaves, and the helmet easily pushes 60 to 80 pounds, and he hasn't even looked at his horse yet. The squire brings over the epiloricon, a thick, padded overgarment that goes on top of the armor for some units. It's essentially a giant stuffed quilt. You might think this is overkill, but it served to catch arrowheads before they could even hit the steel, dulling their kinetic energy. It's a system of redundant protection, layers on layers on layers. It represents a philosophy of survival at any cost. The Byzantine Empire couldn't afford to lose trained men. They were too expensive to replace, so they turned them into the most protected beings on the planet. As the rider finally prepares to mount, you see the exhaustion already beginning to prick at the corners of his eyes, and the day hasn't even truly begun. He has to maintain this posture, this weight, and this focus for hours under a sun that wants to bake him alive. You realize then that the armor wasn't just a suit, It was a prison that the rider chose to live in for the sake of the empire. It's a testament to the sheer will of the Byzantine soldier. A man who was willing to become a machine of iron just to hold the line against an unforgiving world. Now that you've seen the rider struggle into his own personal fortress, your attention shifts to the real hero of this story, the horse. You aren't looking at a nimble pony or a sleek racing stallion. The animal being led toward the rider is a mountain of muscle and bone, a specialized breed that looks more like a modern draft horse than a desert scout. In the Byzantine world, these were often descendants of the legendary Nisaean horses from Persia, beasts famed for their size, speed, and the ability to carry a literal ton of weight without collapsing. If the rider is the pilot, this horse is the tank chassis. You probably wouldn't survive a kick from this thing even without the armor. It would be like getting hit by a falling anvil. You watch as the horse stands patiently, its eyes calm, while three squires begin the laborious process of uppermooring it. This isn't just a horse. It's a genetic masterpiece bred for high-stress environments. One mainstream historical fact about these animals is that the Byzantine government actually ran state-owned horse farms, or matata, specifically to ensure a constant supply of these heavy-duty chargers. They couldn't rely on local markets for something this specialized. These horses had to be large enough to carry the 80 pounds rider, plus another 60 to 90 pounds of equine barding, all while maintaining the stamina to maneuver on a chaotic battlefield. But it's not just about size, it's about temperament. Here, as a quirky tidbit, these horses were often desensitized to the sounds of war from the time they were foals. Grooms would bang metal pots together during feeding time or wave brightly colored banners in their faces while they ran. The goal was to create an animal that would unflinch when 1,000 arrows hissed overhead or when a flaming pot of Greek fire exploded nearby. A horse that panics is a death sentence for a cataphract. If this beast decides to bolt, the rider, encased in his rigid steel cage, has almost no chance of bailing out safely. As the squires drape the first layer over the horse's back, you notice it's a heavy felt pad. This is the cushion for the metal to come. Historians still argue whether the Byzantines preferred leatherback scale or purely metallic plates for their horses. But most agree that the 10th century standard was a sophisticated mix. You see the klibanion for the horse being hoisted up. It's composed of two massive side pieces and a chest piece, all linked by heavy leather straps. It's a literal coat of mail for a quadruped. You watch the horse's muscles ripple as it adjusts to the sudden weight, its hooves digging into the Anatolian soil. The horse's head is the next priority. The squires fasten the promopedion, a rigid plate that covers the forehead and the bridge of the nose. It makes the horse look like a mythological creature, a unicorn of steel. You notice there are small slits for the eyes, protected by fine bronze mesh. This was crucial. While the rest of the horse might be invincible, a single arrow to the eye would send the animal into a blind, agonizing frenzy. The horse's ears poke out through leather-linked holes, twitching as they catch the sound of distant horns. You take a step closer and see the peristithidion, the armor protecting the horse's chest. This area is vital because, in a charge, the chest is the first thing that hits the enemy line. It's reinforced with thicker scales, designed to deflect the spears of the infantry. There's something eerie about the way the horse's breathing sounds through the metal, a heavy, muffled huffing that vibrates the plates. You realize the animal is essentially wearing a heavy winter coat made of iron in the middle of a Mediterranean summer. The heat management for the horse was just as critical as it was for the rider. If the horse overheated and its heart gave out, the cataphract was effectively neutralized. There is an open scholarly debate about the doping of these horses, not with modern chemicals, of course, but with wine or herbal stimulants. Some contemporary accounts suggest that before a major engagement, the horses were given grains soaked in wine to dull their fear and give them a temporary burst of aggressive energy. Whether it was true or just the exaggeration of terrified enemies, the result was the same: a relentless, unshakable force that felt less like an animal and more like a force of nature. As the final straps are tightened under the horse's belly, you see the paraparidia, the side flaps that hang down to protect the horse's legs and flanks. This is what gives the cataphract its skirted appearance. These weren't solid plates, as the horse still needed to be able to gallop, but rather overlapping rows of scales that moved like the scales of a fish. You see the horse take a few experimental steps. The sound is incredible, not the clop-clop of a normal horse, but a heavy metallic grinding, like a slow-moving landslide. The bond between the rider and this specific animal had to be absolute. Because the cataphract was often holding a two-handed lance, he couldn't always use the reins to steer. He had to rely on his knees, his weight, and the voice commands the horse had learned over years of training. You see the rider approach his mount now. He doesn't just hop on, he needs a mounting block or the assistance of his squires to be hoisted up. When he finally settles into the saddle, the horse doesn't even buckle. It stands like a mountain. You look at the duo, now a man of iron on a beast of steel. It is an expensive, high maintenance, an incredibly lethal combination. This wasn't just a soldier on a horse. It was a psychological weapon designed to convince the enemy that resistance was mathematically impossible. The sheer investment in this single animal, the breeding, the training, the years of grain, and the custom-fitted armor represents the entire economic output of a small town. As the duo begins to trot toward the assembly point, you can't help but feel a sense of awe. You're looking at the absolute peak of pre-industrial military technology, a titan of the ancient world, ready to crush anything in its path. As the sun catches the flank of the horse, you find yourself mesmerized by the hypnotic pattern of the metal. To understand the Byzantine cataphract, you have to appreciate the blacksmith's masterpiece, the klibanion, this ISNT, a single sheet of hammered steel like the breastplates you see in later Renaissance movies. No, this is much more complex. You're looking at lamellar armor, a sophisticated system of hundreds of small rectangular plates called lamella. Each plate is meticulously punched with holes and then laced to its neighbor using rawhide or silk cord. The genius of this design is in the overlap. Every plate covers the one below it and beside it, meaning that, in most places, an enemy S-blade or arrow has to punch through 2 or even 3 layers of hardened steel to reach the skin. You watch a camp smith making a quick repair, his fingers moving with practiced ease as he replaces a snapped leather thong. One mainstream historical fact about this armor is its modularity, because it's made of small, individual pieces. A cataphract whose armor was damaged in the morning could have it fully repaired by the afternoon. You didn't need to replace the whole suit, you just swapped out the broken scales. This made the Byzantine army incredibly resilient during long campaigns. While a Western knight might be out of luck if his solid plate was dented or pierced, the cataphract was always back in the iron tide within hours. Here's a quirky tidbit: the scales weren't always flat. Many smiths hammered a central ridge or medial rib into each individual lamella. This wasn't just for aesthetics. It worked exactly like the crimping on a modern tin can, adding immense structural rigidity to the metal without increasing its weight. It also served to deflect the point of an arrow, sliding it off the ridge and into the overlapping gap where the energy would be safely absorbed by the thick leather backing. Historians still argue whether the Byzantines preferred iron or bronze for these scales. While iron was harder, bronze didn't rust in the salty air of the Mediterranean coast, leading to a vibrant, multicolored look in many units where the two metals were mixed for both economy and style. The construction process was a logistical marathon. Think about the math. A single suit for a rider might require 500 to 700 lamellae, and the barding for his horse could easily require double that. Each hole had to be punched by hand, each edge filed smooth so it wouldn't saw through the lacing, and each plate quenched in oil to provide the perfect balance between hardness and flexibility. You notice the way the plates grow upward. Unlike scale armor, which usually hangs downward like shingles on a roof, lamellar is often laced so the plates overlap upward. This was a deliberate design choice for cavalry. It prevented an infantryman's spear from sliding up into the joints when he poked at the rider from below. There is an open scholarly debate about the flexibility versus protection trade-off in these suits. Some researchers believe the lacing was kept relatively loose to allow the armor to breathe and move with the rider's muscles, while others argue it was cinched tight to create a rigid shell that distributed the weight more evenly. As you watch the rider move, you see the truth is somewhere in the middle. The armor ripples like the skin of a serpent. When the horse turns, the metal plates slide over one another with a sound like a deck of steel cards being shuffled. It's a terrifyingly beautiful symphony of engineering. The smith finishes his work and tosses a handful of sand and oil over the repaired section, buffing it until it glows. Maintenance was the hidden war. You probably would unsurvive the boredom of the daily sand and oil routine required to keep these suits from turning into a pile of orange rust. Every evening after a march, the cataphract and his servants would spend hours scrubbing the plates. A rusted scale was a brittle scale, and a brittle scale was a death sentence. This obsession with polish had a secondary effect on the battlefield. The mirror finish was so bright that it could literally blind enemy archers, making it impossible for them to aim at specific gaps in the armor. You look closely at the horse's lorica equina again. The scales here are larger, designed to withstand heavier impacts. You notice that the smith has used a composite approach steel for the chest and forehead, but perhaps hardened leather or queer buoy for the areas under the belly to save weight. This wasn't just mindless metal cladding, it was a highly optimized weight distribution system. The Byzantines knew that every extra pound they saved was an extra minute their horse could stay in the fight. As the smith puts away his tools, you realize that the klibanion was more than just protection. It was a status symbol, the quality of the lacing, the decorative engravings on the borders, and the sheen of the metal told everyone exactly where you stood in the imperial hierarchy. You're looking at a piece of equipment that cost more than a small villa, maintained by specialists, and worn by an elite who viewed themselves as the literal shield of God. The blacksmith's masterpiece was the foundation of the empire's survival, a testament to a civilization that could organize the production of millions of individual steel scales to keep the iron men moving forward. As you continue to circle the stationary unit, you notice something surprising. Amidst the sea of cold steel and bronze, there is a distinct, shimmering softness. Peeking out from under the heavy hems of the klibanion and lining the high collars of the riders is a fabric that seems entirely too delicate for a blood-soaked battlefield. Pure Byzantine silk. You might think it's just a flashy display of wealth of flex by the elite soldiers of the richest city on earth, but this is actually a piece of life-saving technology. In the 10th century, silk was the closest thing the world had to Kevlar. You probably would unsurvive a deep puncture wound in the middle of a dusty Anatolian field without it. As the infection would claim, you long before the blood loss did. The secret lies in the tensile strength of the silk fiber. One mainstream historical fact about Byzantine warfare is their obsession with clean wounds. Unlike wool or linen, which have coarse fibers that snap and get driven into the flesh by an arrowhead, silk is incredibly difficult to break. When a nomadic horse archer lets fly a bodkin point arrow that manages to find a gap in your lamellar, the silk doesn't tear. Instead, it stretches. It forms a tiny protective glove around the arrowhead as it enters your body. This meant that the metal never actually touched your internal tissue. Here's a quirky tidbit. The Byzantine government actually had a silk monopoly, and the highest grades of silk, particularly the imperial purple or murixtede varieties, were strictly regulated. However, for the cataphracts, the silk wasn't about the color, it was about the weave. They often wore a garment called the Cavalry, which could be a padded silk tunic. It was so effective that some contemporary accounts claim riders could walk away from a skirmish looking like human pincushions, with dozens of arrows hanging off them. They weren't actually hurt. The arrows were simply stuck in the layers of silk and padding, unable to punch through to the skin. Historians still argue whether the Byzantines fully understood the antiseptic properties of silk, or if they just got lucky with their fashion choices. Silk is naturally smoother and less likely to harbor the kind of bacteria found in sweaty wool, which meant a silk-wrapped wound was far less likely to turn gangrenous. In an era where a flesh wound was often a death sentence, this was a You watch a rider adjust his silk neckguard, or poitrels. It looks like a high-fashion scarf, but it's actually there to ensure that if a blade slides under his helmet's mail curtain, the silk will catch the edge and prevent it from biting deep into the jugular. This focus on the inner layer highlights the Byzantine philosophy of warfare. It was a science, not just a struggle. You realize that everything you see, from the heaviest iron plate to the thinnest silk thread, is part of a redundant system of survival. They didn't just want to win the battle. They wanted to bring their expensive, highly trained soldiers home. The horse, too, benefited from this. While the horse didn't wear silk tunics, the heavy felt padding beneath its armor served a similar purpose, absorbing the kinetic energy of missiles that would otherwise have shattered the animal's ribs or legs. There's an open scholarly debate about how much this silk armor cost the imperial treasury. Silk was literally worth its weight in gold at various points in history. Providing thousands of sets of silk-lined undergarments to the tagmata, professional standing regiments, was a massive financial undertaking. But when you consider the cost of training a cataphract from childhood, the price of the silk was a bargain. It was an insurance policy. You see the rider pull on his silk-lined gauntlets, and you realize that even his hands are protected by this invisible, luxurious shield. As the wind picks up, the silk surcoats of the unit flutter, creating a strange contrast with the rigid, unmoving metal of the horses. It's a reminder that the Byzantine Empire was the crossroads of the world. They took the silk of the East and the iron of the West and fused them into a single, terrifying weapon. You aren't just looking at a soldier. You're looking at a global supply chain in human form. Every time that rider moves, you hear the faint, high-pitched hiss of silk rubbing against steel, the sound of the most expensive protection money could buy. The use of silk also had a psychological impact. To the barbarian tribes facing them, the Byzantines looked like supernatural beings, shimmering, colorful, and seemingly impervious to pain. When an arrow hit a cataphract and he didn't even flinch, it wasn't just the steel he was trusting, it was the soft, hidden layer of silk that gave him the confidence to keep riding. You take a final look at the intricate embroidery on a captain's sleeve and realize that, in the world of the cataphract, luxury and lethality were two sides of the same coin. Now, your focus shifts lower, toward the powerful, steady breath of the horse. If you were an enemy soldier, this is the face of your nightmare. The squires are currently fastening the prometopidion, or the equine head armor, and it transforms the animal from a beast of burden into a frightening, faceless construct. Imagine a solid plate of iron or hardened bronze, shaped precisely to follow the curve of the horse's skull. It covers the forehead and the bridge of the nose, often extending down toward the nostrils. You probably wouldn't survive the sheer terror of seeing 1,000 of these steel-faced monsters galloping toward you. The horse's eyes, visible only through small, mesh-covered slits, look cold and mechanical, stripped of any animal mercy. One mainstream historical fact that makes this piece of equipment so vital is the target priority of ancient warfare. Infantrymen were specifically trained to aim for the horse's head. A single well-placed arrow, or a spear thrust to the face, would cause a horse to rear up in agony, throwing the rider and breaking the formation. By forging the prometopidion, the Byzantines effectively closed that off button. The metal was usually thickest right between the eyes, designed to take the brunt of a direct impact. You notice the smiths have even added small flares at the edges of the plate to deflect blades away from the horse's sensitive ears. Here's a quirky tidbit. These head plates weren't just flat sheets of metal. They were often highly decorative, featuring embossed crosses, lions, or even the Gorgon's head to ward off evil. But the most practical and slightly weird feature was the plumage holder at the top. Commanders would attach bright crests of dyed horse hair, red, yellow, or green to the forehead plate. While it looked like the horse was wearing a fancy hat, it actually served a vital purpose. It helped the riders keep track of their unit leaders in the absolute chaos and blinding dust of a charge. It was the medieval equivalent of a high-visibility vest, just much more intimidating. Historians still argue whether these masks were lined with lead for extra weight, or if that would have been too much for the horse's neck to handle. Most believe a thick lining of wool or felt was the standard, acting as a shock absorber. You see a squire adjust the leather straps that go behind the horse's ears. It has to be tight enough to stay on during a collision, but loose enough that the horse can still work its jaw to breathe. This was a delicate balance of engineering. If the mask shifted during the charge, the horse would be blinded, and a blinded tank is just a very heavy wrecking ball looking for a place to crash. As you watch the horse toss its head, the metal clanks against the chest piece, creating a rhythmic, industrial sound. There's an open scholarly debate about how much these masks limited the horse's peripheral vision. Some suggest it was a feature, not a bug. By limiting what the horse could see to the sides, the animal was less likely to be spooked by the carnage happening around its feet. It forced the horse to focus only on what was directly in front of it, the enemy line. It turned a flighty, sensitive animal into a focused, forward-moving projectile. The craftsmanship involved here is staggering. Unlike the body armor, which is made of many small scales, the prometopidion is often a single, large piece of raised metalwork. The smith had to start with a flat sheet and slowly, carefully, beat it into the complex three-dimensional shape of a horse's head. One wrong move with the hammer and the whole piece would be ruined. You can see the hammer marks on the inside of the plate, a silent testimony to the hours of labor that went into protecting just this one part of the animal. You notice a specific detail, a small, reinforced nasal section. In the heat of battle, horses need an incredible amount of oxygen. The Byzantines were careful to ensure the armor didn't constrict the nostrils. They even flared the bottom of the mask so that the horse's hot, heavy breath wouldn't fog up the mesh over the eyes. It's this kind of attention to detail that allowed the Byzantine military to remain the premier force in the world for so long. They didn't just throw armor at the problem, they engineered solutions. As the sun reflects off the polished surface of the mask, the horse looks less like a living thing and more like a temple statue brought to life. You realize that this mask is the final psychological barrier. When a man looks at a horse, he sees an animal he can potentially scare or hurt. When he looks at a prometopidion, he sees his own reflection in the steel and the inevitable end of his own life. The mask was designed to break the enemy's will before the lance even touched their shield. And as you stand there in its shadow, it's easy to see why. As your gaze travels down from the horse's steel-masked face, you realize the protection doesn't stop at the neck. To truly understand the iron tide, you have to look at the peristithidion and the heavy skirts of the horse, the skirt of steel. This is a massive, overlapping curtain of metal scales and thick felt that drapes over the horse's chest and flanks, often reaching all the way down to its knees. If you were an enemy spearman, this is the wall that would hit you first. You probably wouldn't survive the impact. It's like being run over by a mobile house made of knives. The sheer weight of the Barding de Larica. Equine is staggering, and you can see the horse's muscles twitching under the burden. Its heavy legs braced like the pillars of a cathedral. One mainstream historical fact about this equine skirt is that it wasn't just for defense. It acted as a stabilizer. The heavy felt and leather backing of the armor dampened the vibrations of the horse's movement, allowing the rider a more stable platform from which to aim his massive lance. This was the original active suspension. You notice how the armor is divided into separate panels, the peristithidion for the chest and the periperidia for the sides. These panels were linked by heavy leather hinges, allowing the horse to gallop and turn without the metal plates buckling or pinching its skin. It's a masterclass in biomechanical engineering from a millennium ago. Here, as a quirky tidbit, the bottom edge of these steel skirts often featured a row of heavy lead weights or small brass bells. It sounds like something for a parade, right? But the lead weights ensured that the armor didn't flap upward during a fast gallop, keeping the horse's belly and legs protected at all times, and the bells, they added to the terrifying sensory overload of the charge. Imagine the sound of 1,000 horses, each with 50 bells, ringing in a chaotic, metallic roar as they bear down on you. It was designed to drown out the screams of the dying and the commands of enemy officers, creating a soundscape of doom that shattered nerves before a single drop of blood was shed. Historians still argue whether the horse's legs were left entirely bare to preserve speed, or if they were protected by greave-like coverings called procnomedia. Some 10th century manuals, like the Siloge Tacticorum, suggest that for the heaviest cataphract units, even the shins of the horse were encased in splinted leather or light metal. You can see the risk adding weight to the lower legs makes the animal tire exponentially faster. However, against a disciplined infantry line that was trained to kneecap horses as they passed, that extra protection was the only thing that kept the unit moving. You see a groom checking the straps around the horse's fetlocks, ensuring the metal isn't chafing the animal's delicate tendons. There is an open scholarly debate regarding the exhaustion limit of these armored beasts. How long could a horse actually operate while draped in 60 kilograms of steel? Most experts agree that the cataphract was an onus weapon in a single day's battle. They weren't used for scouting or chasing down fleeing enemies. They were held in reserve, shielded from the sun by umbrellas or portable tents, until the exact moment the enemy line showed a crack. Then, and only then, would they be unleashed for a single crushing push. You realize the cataphract isn't a soldier in the modern sense. It's a precision-guided munition made of flesh and iron. You look at the way the sunlight plays across the pterygius, the decorative leather strips that hang from the bottom of the armor. They are dyed in the deep crimson of the empire, fluttering in the breeze. Beneath them, the horse's hide is slick with sweat. This skirt of steel turned the horse into a literal battering ram. In a world before gunpowder, mass was the ultimate weapon. If you could put enough weight behind a charge, the physics of the impact didn't care how brave the enemy was. Bones would snap, shields would splinter, and the line would break simply because it didn't have the physical density to resist. The maintenance of this skirt was a logistical nightmare. Because it hung so close to the ground, it was constantly being pelted with mud, stones, and blood. If the scales weren't cleaned immediately after a battle, the organic matter would rot the leather thongs holding the metal together. You see a servant using a stiff brush to scrub dried Anatolian clay from the scales. It's a reminder that for every hour of glorious combat, there were 10 hours of back-breaking cleaning. This was an industrial army, and the industrial part happened in the stables and the smithy. As the horse shifts, the entire skirt clangs with a heavy, resonant thud. It's the sound of power. You realize that by arming the horse's chest and flanks so thoroughly, the Byzantines weren't just protecting an animal, they were protecting their investment. This horse represents decades of breeding and thousands of gold numismata. To lose it to a lucky spear poke from a peasant would be a strategic catastrophe. The skirt of steel was the final insurance policy of an empire that refused to let its power be undermined by the cheap weapons of its enemies. As you stand in the shadow of this iron behemoth, you begin to realize that the Byzantine cataphract wasn't just a military unit, it was a metabolic crisis on 4 legs. To keep this armored tank moving, you have to consider a factor that most history books ignore: the staggering, almost impossible caloric requirements of the horse. This isn't a nimble pony living off scrub brush and morning dew. This is a massive high-performance engine that burns through fuel at an alarming rate. You probably wouldn't survive the financial stress of feeding just one of these animals for a month. The cost of the grain alone could feed a human family for a year. One mainstream historical fact that illustrates the scale of this problem is the Byzantine reliance on the unknown Stateran logistics system that ensured the army was fed. A warhorse of this size, carrying nearly 300 pounds of rider and armor, required roughly 25 to 30 pounds of forage and at least 10 to 12 pounds of high-energy grain, like barley or oats, every single day. Multiply that by a regiment of 500 cataphracts, and you are looking at a logistical nightmare of moving tons of specialized feed across a dry, dusty landscape. This is why the Byzantines were so obsessed with controlling the fertile river valleys of Anatolia. Without those crops, the Iron Tide would literally starve into a standstill. Here's a quirky tidbit. The Byzantines were early pioneers of equine sports medicine. The military manuals, or strategica, often included detailed instructions on the wetting of grain. They discovered that if they soaked the barley in water or mixed it with chopped straw, known as atron, the horse could digest it more efficiently and stay hydrated longer. There are even accounts of energy balls made of honey, flour, and oil being fed to the horses before a major push to give them a quick glucose spike. It's essentially a medieval version of an energy gel for an endurance athlete, designed to give the horse that final burst of power needed to break a shield wall. Historians still argue about the impact of the Little Ice Age or shifting climate patterns on the availability of this fodder. Some suggest that the loss of certain grazing lands to the advancing Seljuk Turks in the 11th century did more to destroy the cataphracts than any sword ever could. If you can't grow the barley, you can't have the horse. If you don't have the horse, the armor is just heavy scrap metal. You watch a groom haul a massive bucket of water to the horse. An animal this size, working under the heat of a steel blanket, can icily drink 15 to 20 gallons of water a day. In the middle of a desert campaign, finding that much clean water was often more important than finding the enemy. There is an open scholarly debate regarding the grazing-to-grain ratio during active marches. Some believe the horses were allowed to graze for several hours a day to save on logistics, while others argue that the specialized Nisaean breeds were too delicate for wild grass and required a strictly controlled diet to maintain their muscle mass. As you watch the horse tilt its head to reach for a stray piece of hay, you see the sheer power in its neck. That muscle is built on high-quality protein and consistent care. These horses were the elite athletes of the animal kingdom, and they were treated with more reverence than many of the infantrymen. You look at the supply wagons parked in the distance. For every 100 cataphracts, there was a train of mules and carts carrying nothing but grain, spare horseshoes, and water skins. It made the Byzantine army a slow, lumbering beast of its own. They couldn't move as fast as the light Arab cavalry, but they didn't need to. They brought their ecosystem with them. The cataphract was a system of total environmental control: protect the man with silk and steel, and protect the horse with the best nutrition the empire could buy. The buffet for a behemoth also extended to the campsite. The horses had to be kept away from damp ground to prevent thrush or hoof rot, which would be instant retirement for a heavy charger. You notice the squires have laid down fresh straw and are meticulously picking stones out of the horse's hooves. A single stone caught between the shoe and the hoof would turn this 1,000 goldies asset into a limping liability. It's a reminder that the glory of the charge was built on a foundation of mud, manure, and the constant, rhythmic grinding of teeth against grain. As the horse finishes its meal and lets out a deep, resonant whinny, you realize that the armor and the horse are two parts of the same machine. The metal provides the defense, but the grain provides the force. Without the buffet, the iron tide is just a static monument. The Byzantines understood that to conquer the world, you first had to conquer the stomach of the beast. As the unit prepares to move, you see the strength in the horse. Guide a strength fueled by the labor of 1,000 farmers and the calculated precision of the imperial grain stores. As the ironclad line begins to dress its ranks, you notice a shift in the atmosphere. It isn't just the physical weight of the steel that hangs over the field, it's the psychological pressure. You are looking at the psychology of the statue. To an enemy infantryman, perhaps a levy from a village who has never seen anything more technologically advanced than a plow, the Byzantine cataphract doesn't look like a human being. The mail coif and the steel mask strip away the rider's face, replacing it with a cold, unblinking metallic glare. You probably would unsurvive the urge to drop your spear and run. The moment 1,000 of these faceless titans began their slow, silent advance. One mainstream historical fact about the cataphracts is that they purposefully utilized dread as a tactical asset. Unlike the boisterous, shouting warriors of the Germanic tribes or the rhythmic chanting of the Roman legions of old, the cataphracts often attacked in a terrifying, disciplined silence. The only sounds were the heavy thud of hooves and the metallic chink-chink of 1,000 sets of barding. This mechanical silence suggested an unstoppable force that couldn't be reasoned with, bribed, or intimidated. You are looking at the medieval version of a robot uprising. Here's a quirky tidbit. The Byzantines actually experimented with the visual frequency of their armor. Some units would alternate their scales: one row of polished steel, one row of blackened iron, or even gilded bronze. As the horse moved, this created a strobing, flickering effect that made it difficult for an observer to judge the exact distance or speed of the rider. It was a 10th century version of dazzle camouflage. If you can tell exactly where the horse's chest ends and the rider's lance begins, you're much more likely to hesitate. And in a cavalry charge, hesitation is death. Historians still argue whether the cataphracts used their masks to amplify their voices or if the silence was truly absolute. Some suggest that the metal helmets acted as a natural resonator, turning a simple battle cry into a booming, otherworldly roar that sounded like it was coming from a giant. Regardless, the statute effect was real. By encasing both man and horse in metal, the Byzantines removed the animal from the equation. You aren't looking at a horse that might get scared. You're looking at a moving wall of iron. You aren't looking at a man who might feel pity. You're looking at a machine of the state. There is an open, scholarly debate about the terror of the mask. Some psychologists argue that the lack of a visible human face triggers a specific, uncanny valley response in the human brain, causing a primal flight-or-fight reaction that bypasses rational thought. This is why the cataphracts were so effective against irregular infantry. Even if you know intellectually that there is a man inside that suit, your lizard brain sees a monster. You watch as a rider adjusts his seat, the movement stiff and deliberate. There is no nodding, no waving, no human gesture, just the iron. You notice how the sun reflects off the rounded surfaces of the horse's promontopidion. It creates a blinding glare that acts as a shield in its own right. If you try to look at the unit, you are met with a wall of light. It's an intentional design to prevent enemy archers from picking out the leaders. If everyone looks like a shimmering statue, who do you aim for? The Byzantines understood that in war, the mind breaks long before the body does. The cataphract was the ultimate tool for that mental breakage. The statue also served to protect the rider's own psychology. Inside that helmet, you are isolated. You are encased in silken steel, separated from the blood, the dust, and the screams of the people you are trampling. It is a form of sensory deprivation that allows a soldier to perform horrific tasks with a sense of detachment. You aren't stabbing a man, you are simply moving your lance through a target. This psychological distance allowed the Byzantine elite to maintain their discipline even in the most gruesome melees. As the command is given and the unit takes its first step forward, the earth itself seems to groan under the weight. The psychological impact is a physical weight in the air. You realize that the horse armor wasn't just for the horse's safety, it was to complete the illusion. An armored man on a naked horse is a vulnerable rider. An armored man on an armored horse is a god of war. As they move closer, the silence is finally broken by the rhythmic, low-frequency thrum of the hooves. A sound that says, more clearly than any shout, that the time for mercy has passed. Training the Iron Duo was not a matter of weeks or months, but a lifelong commitment that began almost as soon as the rider could walk and the horse was weaned. You are watching a dance that has been rehearsed for years, a synchronization of two different species into a single, lethal organism. If you were to try and mount one of these horses today, you probably wouldn't survive the first 10 seconds. The animal is so finely tuned to the subtle shifts in its rider's weight that a novice's clumsy movements would be interpreted as a command to charge, pivot, or buck. This is training the Iron Duo, where the line between man and beast is blurred by 1,000 hours of drill in the dust of the imperial hippodromes. One mainstream historical fact about the cataphracts is their reliance on the Nikaman system, because the Byzantine contos, that massive formidor lance, often required two hands to level effectively at a full trot. The rider couldn't always rely on reins to steer his mount. Instead, the rider used his inner thighs and knees, applying pressure to the horse's flanks to signal a turn. You see a rider practicing this now, his hands resting on the pommel while the horse weaves perfectly between wooden markers. This level of control is what allowed the Byzantine wedge formation to remain tight. If one horse drifted, the entire armored wall would collapse into a pile of tangled metal. Here's a quirky tidbit. The training wasn't just about movement, it was about noise conditioning. Byzantine trainers would lead the horses through gauntlets of sound. They would have infantrymen bang their shields with swords, blow discordant trumpets, and even release pigs or other small animals to run under the horse's feet. There are records of trainers using early forms of incendiary practice, where they would wave torches or set small, controlled fires near the horses to ensure the animals wouldn't bolt when the Greek fire started flowing. By the time a cataphract horse reached the battlefield, it was essentially a Zen master in a world of chaos. Historians still argue whether the riders were trained in specific equine wrestling techniques. Some manuals suggest that if a cataphract was dehorsed, the animal was trained to stay by its master and even use its heavy armored chest to push enemies away. You watch as a trainer simulates a fall and the horse immediately circles back, standing over the fallen man like a guardian. This wasn't just a tool, it was a partner. The survival of the rider depended on the horse's loyalty, and the survival of the horse depended on the rider's ability to guide it through the only gaps in the enemy's spears. There is an open scholarly debate regarding the use of voice cues in battle. While the silence of the charge was a psychological weapon, many believe the riders used specific low-frequency hums or clicks that could be heard by the horse even through the layers of the metal prometopidion. This allowed for secret communication that the enemy couldn't intercept. You notice a rider leaning forward, whispering into the horse's ear. The animal's ears flick back, catching every syllable. In the heat of combat, where vision was limited by the helmet's narrow slits, these auditory signals were the data link that kept the unit functioning. The physical conditioning for the horse was equally brutal. To carry 300 pounds of weight, the horse had to develop massive core and leg strength. They were marched up steep hills and through deep sand to build the kind of explosive power needed to go from a steady walk to a devastating trot in seconds. You can see the result in the horse's hindquarters. They are broad, powerful, and twitching with potential energy. A cataphract horse didn't just walk, it surged. It was the difference between being hit by a bicycle and being hit by a freight train. The rider's training was no less intense. He had to learn how to fall while wearing 60 pounds of garaskill that involved a specific rolling motion to prevent the armor from crushing his own ribs or snapping his neck. You see a group of young recruits practicing mounting the moving horse, where they have to leap into the high-back saddle while the animal is at a trot. It's an athletic feat that would make a modern gymnast sweat. They are taught to treat their armor as a second skin, learning to compensate for the shifted center of gravity that comes with being a killman. As the duo completes their practice run, you see the mutual respect between them. The rider wipes the sweat from the horse's neck where the armor doesn't cover, and the horse nudges the rider's steel-clad shoulder. This bond was the secret ingredient of the Byzantine military. It wasn't just the iron or the silk, It was the years of shared sweat and shared silence. You realize that the Iron Tide wasn't just a collection of equipment, it was a community of two species teams, each member ready to die for the other in the name of the emperor. As the line of iron continues its steady, rhythmic advance, your eyes are drawn to the primary weapon that gave the cataphract its terrifying reach, the contos. This is not the light, ashwood lance of a Western knight. This is a form-to-long, nearly 13 feet behemoth of a spear. It is thick, heavy, and capped with a leaf-shaped steel head that has been honed to a razor's edge. You probably wouldn't survive the mere attempt to level this weapon with one hand. It requires the coordinated strength of the rider's entire upper body, and often, both hands to guide it into the kill zone. The Kontos was the long-range missile of the 10th century, designed to outreach the spears of the infantry and the shorter lances of enemy cavalry. One mainstream historical fact about the Kontos is that its name is derived from the Greek word for oar. This gives you a sense of its girth and weight. When a cataphract unit leveled their lances, it looked like a forest of steel-tipped wood descending upon the enemy. Because the lance was so long, the impact occurred several feet before the horse even reached the enemy line. This was the physics of the human projectile. By the time the horse's armored chest piece made contact, the Kontos had already punched through a shield, a layer of mail, and the man behind it, the kinetic energy of a three-quartern horse, moving at a trot, concentrated into a single steel point, was enough to lift a man clean off his feet and throw him backward like a ragdoll. Here is a quirky tidbit. The Kontos was often fitted with a small leather loop or wrist strap, not to keep the rider from losing it, but to help him recover it after an impact. If the lance did unshatter which, it often did, the rider could use the momentum of the horse's continued movement to unstick the weapon from his victim. However, many cataphracts carried a secondary maceques, or a heavy broadsword, because the Kontos was essentially a singlest tactical tool. Once the initial wall of spears had broken the enemy's front line, the lances were often dropped in favor of weapons better suited for the claustrophobic phone booth fight of a melee. Historians still argue about whether the cataphracts of the 10th century used the couched lance technique to king the spear under the armpitor if they stuck to the traditional two-handed Sarmatian style, while the couched technique allowed for more stability. The two-handed grip gave the rider more flexibility to change targets at the last second. You watch a rider practice a thrust and pull maneuver, his muscles bulging even through the layers of his klibanion. This wasn't just a charge, it was a precision strike. If the lance hit a shield at the wrong angle, the vibration could shatter the rider's collarbone or throw him from his seat. There is an open scholarly debate regarding the impact shock of these weapons, without the high-backed, wrap-around saddles that would later define European knighthood. How did the Byzantine rider stay on his horse? Some believe the Byzantines used a specialized four-horn saddle that pinched the rider's thighs, providing a solid anchor. Others argue it was pure, grueling core strength. You see a rider brace his feet in the stirrups, leaning forward as he levels the Kontos. The horse seems to lean in as well, anticipating the jolt. It is a moment of extreme tension, where the weight of the empire is focused onto a few square inches of sharpened steel. You notice the kill zone is surprisingly narrow. The cataphract doesn't want to get into a swirling dogfight. He wants to punch a hole. The Kontos is the drill bit. If the first rank of cataphracts succeeds in their thrust, the enemy formation ceases to be a unit and becomes a collection of panicked individuals. You see the tip of the lance shimmering in the heat. It is perfectly balanced despite its length. The smiths who forged these heads used a higher carbon steel for the tip, ensuring it wouldn't dull or bend when meeting the boss of a shield. The sound of the lances being lowered is a sound you'll never forget: low, wooden whoosh, followed by the collective rattle of the steel tips. It's the sound of the curtain closing on an era of light warfare. As the riders approach the practice targets, the impact is deafening. Even the wooden dummies are splintered into toothpicks. You realize that the horse's armor was the shield, but the Kontos was the hammer. Together, they turn the cavalrymen into a living siege engine. As the rider pulls his horse back into line, the Kontos is held upright once more, a vertical line against the sky. The sheer physicality of the weapon is a reminder that Byzantine warfare was an industrial process. It required specialized wood from the mountains, specialized steel from the imperial forges, and specialized men with the strength to wield them. You stand in the wake of the charge, looking at the shattered remnants of the targets. And you finally understand why the cataphract was the most feared sight in the medieval world. They didn't just fight you, they deleted you from the battlefield before you could even reach for your sword. As the afternoon sun reaches its zenith over the parched landscape, a new enemy emerges, one that no amount of steel or silk can truly deflect. You are standing in the middle of a portable oven. The Anatolian heat is legendary, often soaring well above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And for a cataphract, this is a lethal environment. You probably wouldn't survive more than an hour in this kit before your heart began to flutter and your vision blurred with heat stroke. Heat, the silent executioner, was often a more effective killer than the enemy's arrows. You watch the riders, their movements slowing, their breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps through the mail curtains covering their mouths. One mainstream historical fact about Byzantine operations is that they strictly avoided midday battles whenever possible. The Strategicon of Maurice and later manuals emphasize the importance of timing. A commander who forced his cataphracts to charge uphill at noon was considered a fool or a traitor. Inside that klibanion, the temperature can easily climb 20 degrees higher than the outside air. The metal absorbs the solar radiation, and the thick quilted padding underneath traps the rider's body heat like an insulated thermos. You see a rider lift his visor for just a second. His face is a deep, alarming shade of beard, slick with a layer of sweat that has nowhere to evaporate. Here's a quirky tidbit. To combat this, Byzantine cataphracts were known to use liquid cooling, though not in the way we think of it today. Before a battle, they would often drench their silk undergarments, and their horses felt paddings in cold water. As they rode, the wind would hit the wet fabric, creating a temporary, evaporative cooling effect. It bought them perhaps 20 minutes of peak performance before the water turned to steam. There are even accounts of riders carrying small sponges soaked in vinegar and water tucked into their cheek guards, which they could suck on to stay hydrated and keep their mouths from swelling shut in the dry dust. Historians still argue whether the high casualty rates in certain famous defeats, like the Battle of Manzikert, were due to tactical failures or simply collective heat exhaustion. When a cataphract is overheated, his reaction times drop to that of a drunk man. He can't balance his lance. He can't feel his horse's cues. You watch a horse stumble slightly, its tongue lolling out the side of its mouth, dripping thick white foam. The animal is wearing a heavy metal blanket in the desert. It is a miracle of biological endurance that they can move at all. The Byzantines knew this, which is why they deployed water squad servants with massive skins of water who would dash between the lines during lulls in the fighting to pour water. Directly over the horses' heads and into the riders' helmets, there is an open scholarly debate regarding the use of sunshades or portable pavilions during the deployment phase. Some evidence suggests that cataphract units remained stationary under large canvas awnings until the very last second, while light infantry skirmishers did the dirty work of softening the enemy. You see the wisdom in this. Every minute spent sitting in the sun is a minute of stamina drained from the battery of the unit. The cataphract is a high-performance machine with a very small cooling reservoir. If you redline the engine too early, it will seize up before it ever hits the enemy line. You notice the rider's armor is starting to smell a pungent mix of sour sweat, horse musk, and hot oil. This was the reality of the Golden Empire. It wasn't just shimmering glory. It was a gritty, salt-caked struggle for breath. The weight of the helmet, which seemed manageable in the cool of the morning, now feels like a lead weight pressing into the rider's spine. Every time the horse jolts, the hot metal of the breastplate chafes against the rider's soaked tunic, creating armor bite that turns the skin into a raw, stinging mess. The horses are in even worse shape because horses can only sweat through their skin, covering 80% of their body in felt, and steel is a recipe for heat collapse. You see a groom desperately fanning a horse with a large palm frond. The animal's nostrils are flared to the size of saucers, trying to pull in enough oxygen to cool its internal organs. This is why the Byzantine cavalry was so expensive, not just because of the gear, but because for every hour of combat, they needed days of recovery and a logistical tail that could provide massive amounts of water in a land where wells are miles apart. As a cloud finally drifts over the sun, providing a momentary reprieve, you see the entire unit let out a collective, muffled sigh. The silent executioner has been held at bay for another few minutes. You realize that the horse armor, while a masterpiece of defense, was also a potential death trap. The Byzantines were playing a high-stakes game of chicken with the elements. betting that they could break the enemy before the sun broke their own soldiers. As the riders prepare for the next maneuver, you can see the grit in their eyes of determination to survive the heat, the weight, and the iron, all for the glory of a city they can only dream of in the cooling shade of the evening. The shimmering armor and the powerful horses are the stars of the show. But if you look behind the ironclad line, you see the true backbone of the Byzantine military machine, the Tudun. This was the massive logistical supply train, a rolling city of wagons, pack animals, and specialists that followed the professional tagmata regiments wherever they went. You probably wouldn't survive a week on the frontier without these guys. They were the difference between a glorious victory and a starving barefoot retreat. Keeping a cataphract in the field was an industrial-scale operation. For every armored rider you see, there are likely 2 or 3 support personnel grooms, smiths, leatherworkers, and medical staff working tirelessly in the dust. One mainstream historical fact about Byzantine logistics is the use of the mitatin. This was a sophisticated system of state-mandated billeting and supply depots. The empire didn't just hope there would be food, they planned for it years in advance. As the cataphracts move, they are followed by heavy wagons carrying spare sets of barding, thousands of replacement horseshoes, and massive quantities of iron rivets. You see a wagon go by, loaded with crates of standardized lamellar, those small steel plates we talked about earlier. Because the armor was modular, the Tudun functioned as a mobile factory. If a rider's horse barding was shredded by Bulgarian axes, the camp smiths could piece together a new set by torchlight while the army slept. Here's a quirky tidbit. The supply train even included specialized artillery for the horses. No, not cannons, but mobile horse hospitals. The Byzantines were among the first to have dedicated veterinary units in the field. They carried vast quantities of wine and vinegar for cleaning equine wounds, and even specialized boots made of thick leather to protect a horse's hoof if it lost a shoe on rocky ground. There are records of these supply trains carrying portable forges that could be set up in under 30 minutes. Imagine the scene. The sun is setting, the air is cooling, and the valley is filled with the rhythmic clink-clink-clink of a dozen smiths hammering out the dents from the day's skirmish. Historians still argue about the mule-to-horse ratio required for a successful campaign. Some suggest that for every cataphract horse, the empire needed at least 2 mules just to carry the water and grain required for that horse to survive. This meant that an army of 5,000 cataphracts was actually a slow-moving parade of nearly 20,000 animals. You can see how this dictated the pace of war. The Byzantines couldn't go anywhere. There wasn't a road or a predictable water source. They were an infrastructure army. They didn't just invade a territory. They paved it, supplied it, and then held it with a wall of iron that was fueled by a constant stream of wagons from the capital. There is an open scholarly debate regarding the civilianization of the supply train. While the riders were elite professionals, many of the wagon drivers and laborers were conscripted peasants or contracted merchants. How did the Byzantines keep this chaotic mass of civilians disciplined during a chaotic retreat? The answer lies in the strategicon, which details exactly how to park the wagons in a laager or a circle to create a mobile fortress. You see the wagons being arranged. Now the wheels are chained together, and the gaps are filled with heavy wooden pavis shields. In an instant, the supply train becomes a defensive work that can protect the expensive cataphracts and their horses while they rest. You notice the spare horses being led at the back of the column. These are the remounts. A cataphract didn't ride his armored warhorse on the march. That would be like driving a tank from New York to Los Angeles. It would wear the animal out before the battle even started. Instead, the rider sat on a smaller, unarmored palfrey, while his warhorse was led unburdened and unarmored by a squire. Only when the scouts reported the enemy was in sight did the upper mooring process begin. This required a level of coordination that most barbarian armies simply couldn't match. The cost of this logistics tale was the primary reason the Byzantine Empire eventually began to shrink. When the central government in Constantinople lost control of the tax-rich provinces, they could no longer afford to pay the smiths, buy the grain, or maintain the thousands of wagons. You see a veteran officer checking the inventory of a supply cart. He looks worried. He knows that a cataphract without a supply train is just a man in a very heavy, very hot suit who will eventually have to walk home. As the sun dips lower, the Tudun begins to set up camp. The smell of cooking fires mingles with the scent of hot iron and horse manure. It is a sensory reminder that the Iron Tide was a living, breathing organism that required constant feeding. You realize that the horse armor wasn't just a piece of equipment. It was the end product of an entire civilization's economic output. The blacksmiths, the farmers, the wagon makers, and the tax collectors were all just as much a part of the cataphract unit as the man holding the lance. As the camp settles into a disciplined rhythm, you see a group of officers gathered around a flickering torch, leafing through a vellum manuscript. This isn't a map, it's a manual. Specifically, it's the Tactica of Leo VI, the Wise. To understand why the Byzantine cataphract wore so much armor, their horses needed their own metal protection. You have to understand that these men didn't just fight. They followed a script. The Byzantine military was the most bureaucratic and academic army in the medieval world. You probably wouldn't survive the strictness of their drill sif. The manual said, "Your horse's chess piece should be exactly 4 fingers below the neck." An inspector would be there with a ruler to ensure it was so. One mainstream historical fact about the Tactica is its emphasis on the combined arms approach. Leo VI wasn't just obsessed with the cataphracts as a hammer, he saw them as part of a complex machine. The manual dictated that cataphracts should never charge alone. They were to be supported by light horse archers on the flanks and a solid core of infantry in the rear. You see this reflected in the way the unit is positioned now. They are the center of a nested formation. The armor was designed to make them a persistent presence on the field of fixed point, around which the rest of the army could maneuver. Here's a quirky tidbit. The Tactica actually includes advice on psychological conditioning for the commander. It suggests that a general should look joyful and confident even when his horse is collapsing from heat, because the cataphracts, locked in their silent iron masks, look to the general as their only source of emotional feedback. There are even instructions on how to use the shimmer of the armor to signal across a valley. By having a specific unit tilt their shields or chests toward the sun in a rhythmic pattern, the Byzantines could send basic commands over miles. Predating the helograph by nearly a millennium, historians still argue whether Leo VI actually wrote the manual himself or if it was a ghost-ridden compilation of centuries of Roman military wisdom. Regardless, the Tactica serves as the definitive user's manual for the armored horseman. It details the wedge formation, the imbolon where the most heavily armored men and horses form the tip of a triangle. You watch the riders practicing this formation. The horses are so close together that the armored skirts of one animal overlap with the next. It creates a literal, gapless wall of moving steel. If the manual was followed correctly, the enemy shouldn't even be able to see the ground beneath the horse's hooves. There is an open scholarly debate about the rigidity of these tactics. Some argue that the Byzantines were too reliant on their manuals, making them predictable to more fluid enemies like the Seljuk Turks. However, others point out that the manuals were constantly updated. By the time of Nikephoros' Phocas in the late 10th century, the armor was made even heavier to counter the improving quality of Eastern archery. You see a junior officer marking a passage in the vellum with a piece of charcoal. They are constantly studying, debating, and refining the science of the Iron Tide. You notice that the manual also covers the human side of the armor. It warns that because the riders are so heavily burdened, they are prone to melancholy and exhaustion. It suggests frequent rotations and ensuring that the horses are bled or massaged after carrying the heavy barding. This level of concern wasn't born of kindness, but of cold, hard economics. A cataphract was a strategic asset, much like a modern stealth bomber. You don't just fly a billion-dollar plane until the engine explodes. You maintain it according to the book. The Tactica also reveals why the horse armor was so essential for the specific maneuvers the Byzantines loved. They favored a countercharge technique where they would let the enemy exhaust themselves against a shield wall, then unleash the cataphracts at a slow, relentless trot. Without the equine armor, the horses would be picked off by skirmishers before they ever reached the main body of the enemy. The manual essentially treats the horse's steel barding as environmental shielding. It allows the unit to exist in the dead zone between two armies where the arrow rain is thickest. As the officers close the book and begin to bark orders, the script comes to life. Every man knows his place, every horse is positioned to the inch, and every strap is checked against the imperial standard. You realize that the cataphract was the physical manifestation of the emperor's will, organized by scholars and executed by professionals. It wasn't a knight in the Western sense of an individual warrior seeking glory. It was a cell in a massive armored organism that moved, breathed, and killed by the book. The sun has finally dipped behind the ragged peaks of the Taurus Mountains, but the work of the empire never truly stops. As you watch the camp cooks distribute rations, you might find yourself wondering, who is paying for all of this? To understand the Byzantine cataphract, you have to look past the steel and silk and stare directly into the imperial ledger. The cost of a single charge was quite literally enough to bankrupt a small province. You probably would unsurvive the tax audit required to keep just one of these units in the field. Every scale on that horse's chest, every link in the rider's mail, and every grain of barley in the feed bags represents a massive diversion of wealth from the civilian economy into the iron tide. One mainstream historical fact that puts this in perspective is the concept of the strategia. This was a military obligation attached to specific plots of land. To be a cataphract, a family usually had to hold a substantial estate worth at least 4 to 6 pounds of gold. The income from this land, the wheat, the wine, the livestock, didn't go to the family's luxury. It was legally earmarked to maintain the rider, his warhorse, his squires, and his staggering array of equipment. You aren't looking at a soldier in the sense of a guy with a paycheck. You're looking at a landed aristocrat whose entire existence is a state-mandated military-industrial project. Here's a quirky tidbit. The Byzantines were so precise with their budgeting that they had a specific insurance payout for horses killed in action. If your cataphract mount, the one that cost more than a dozen ordinary plow horses, was lost in battle, the state would sometimes compensate the rider from the stratiata concassa, the military chest. However, there was a catch. You had to prove the horse died because of heroic action, and not because you forgot to water it or left it out in the sun to bake. This led to a very bureaucratic form of warfare, where officers had to file what were essentially 10th-century insurance claims, while the blood was still wet on their lances. Historians still argue about whether this extreme cost was the very thing that eventually strangled the empire. By the mid-11th century, the provincial military districts were struggling to support the rising costs of increasingly heavy armor. As the enemy's bows got stronger, the armor had to get thicker, which meant the horses had to be bigger, which meant they ate more, which meant taxes had to go up. It was a vicious cycle of defense inflation. You see an older cataphract polishing his father's old breastplate. He's lucky. A new suit of high-grade lamellar could cost upwards of 50 gold. Numismata, some a common laborer would unsee in 3 lifetimes. There is an open scholarly debate regarding the professional versus feudal nature of these troops. While they held land like later Western knights, they were governed by a central Roman bureaucracy that could move them across the map with a single parchment order. This gave the empire a level of strategic mobility that no one else had, but it was incredibly fragile. If the central tax office in Constantinople failed for even a few months, the supply of iron and grain stopped, and the iron tide simply evaporated. You see the riders checking their equipment with a sort of grim financial focus. They know they are the most expensive things in the world, and that makes them targets for both the enemy and the tax collector. The cost of the equine armor, the barding, was a huge part of this fiscal weight. While a rider might keep his mail for 20 years, the horse's barding was subject to incredible wear and tear. Constant movement, sweat-induced corrosion, and the sheer physical trauma of carrying a rider meant the leather straps and silk lacings had to be replaced constantly. You notice a scribe moving through the lines, counting horses and checking the condition of the metal. This was the accounting of war. Every dent in a horse's prometopidion was a line item in a budget back in the capital. The Byzantines even calculated the opportunity cost of these men. Every hour a cataphract spent drilling was an hour he was managing his estate or contributing to the local economy. But the empire viewed it as a necessary evil. In a world where you are surrounded by enemies on all sides, the only thing more expensive than a cataphract is the cost of losing a war. You realize that the horse's metal protection was unjust physical. It was a financial shield for the state. If the horse survives, the investment survives to fight another day. As the night deepens, you see the riders sleeping near their horses, their expensive kits piled neatly beside them. It is a quiet moment in a very loud, very expensive history. You understand now that the iron tide wasn't just powered by courage or steel. It was powered by the meticulous, grinding machinery of Byzantine taxation. The horse armor was the final heavy layer of a system that demanded everything from its citizens so that it could. put a few thousand unbeatable men into the field. The morning air is brittle with frost as the horn sounds for deployment. You are about to witness the Cataphracts' signature move, the embolon, or the Great Armored Wedge. This isn't a wild, scattered gallop. It is a mathematical formation designed to maximize the crush depth of the unit. You probably wouldn't survive the mere pressure of standing in the middle of this formation, even if there were no enemies around. The horses are packed so tightly together that their armored flanks are literally grinding against one another. It is a wall of shields and hooves that moves with the terrifying inevitability of a glacier. One mainstream historical fact about the Byzantine wedge is its specific composition. According to the Precepta Militaria of Emperor Nikephoros Phocas, the wedge was usually 20 ranks deep. The first rank consisted of 20 men, the second of 24, and so on, expanding until the base of the triangle was reached. However, the most vital part was the center. The core of the wedge was often hollow or filled with horse archers who could fire over the heads of the armored giants in front. You see the riders positioning themselves with a level of precision that would make a drill sergeant weep. Every horse's nose is aligned with the tail of the horse in front, creating a solid spine of steel. Here's a quirky tidbit. To keep the horses from drifting apart in the chaos, some units used leg chains or soft silk tethers between the rider's stirrups. While historians still argue whether this was a common practice or just a desperate measure for less experienced units, the goal was the same: total cohesion. If the line broke, the cataphract lost his greatest defense, his neighbor's armor. You notice the riders are almost locked together. As the horses breathe, the entire wedge seems to expand and contract like a single metallic lung. It is the ultimate expression of the Byzantine system over individual heroics. Historians still argue about the actual speed of the charge. Despite what you see in epic movies, a wedge of cataphracts almost never reached a full gallop. Why? Because a horse, carrying 300 pounds of gear, can T-gallop for more than a few hundred yards without its heart literally bursting. And more importantly, a gallop destroys the formation. You watch as the wedge begins to move at a snappy walk, then a steady trot. This was the sweet spot. It was fast enough to give the contos its killing power, but slow enough that the armored horses could maintain their shoulder-to-shoulder contact. It was a slow-motion car crash that the enemy could see coming from a mile away but lacked the power to stop. There is an open scholarly debate regarding the impact physics of the wedge. Some researchers believe the primary goal wasn't to kill everyone in the front line, but to use the physical weight of the armored horses to push the enemy formation backward until it tripped over itself. If you can force the front rank of a Bulgarian shield wall to take 2 steps back, the 10th rank will fall over and the unit will dissolve into a pile of panicked men. You see the wedge pick up speed, the sound of 500 horses embarking, creating a low-frequency hum that you can feel in your teeth. This is shock warfare in its truest sense. You notice the point of the wedge, the primus. This man and his horse are the most heavily armored individuals in the entire empire. The horse is encased in the thickest scale mail available, and the rider's klibanion is reinforced with extra steel plates. His job is the most dangerous, to be the first thing that hits the enemy's spears. If he survives the first 10 seconds, the wedge will penetrate. If he falls, the wedge might blunt, and the horses behind him will be forced to swerve, shattering the formation. You see the primus lower his visor, his world narrowing to the small gap between the enemy's shields. The horse armor plays its most critical role here. As the wedge enters the red zone, the enemy infantry will desperately try to stab at the horses' chests and bellies. You see the peristathidion, that heavy chest plate, doing its work, deflecting spear points that would otherwise have gutted a normal warhorse. The metal skirts protect the legs from the low-swinging axes of the boldest defenders. It is a machine designed to ignore the static of lesser weapons and focus entirely on the signal of the breakthrough. As the wedge makes contact, the sound is like 1,000 blacksmiths hitting 1,000 anvils at once. There is no shouting, only the grinding of metal on wood and the wet thud of lances finding their mark. You realize that the wall of shields and hooves is the pinnacle of Byzantine logic. They didn't want a fair fight, they wanted a mechanical solution to the problem of human resistance. And as the wedge disappears into the cloud of dust and the broken lines of the enemy, you know that the iron tide has done exactly what it was engineered to do. As the dust of the initial impact begins to settle, you notice a strange phenomenon on the battlefield. The air is thick with a persistent, high-pitched hiss, the sound of thousands of arrows raining down on the armored wedge. If you were a horse archer from the steppes, this would be your archer's nightmare. You probably wouldn't survive the sheer frustration of seeing your best shots, fired from a powerful composite bow, simply bounce off the iron scales like rain off a slate roof. You watch a cataphract rider as a heavy bodkin arrow strikes his shoulder. He doesn't even turn his head. He just keeps moving forward, the arrow clattering harmlessly to the ground, leaving nothing but a small silver scratch on his klibanion. One mainstream historical fact about Byzantine armor is its specific resistance to the Parthian shot and other nomadic archery tactics. The composite bow of the era was a marvel of engineering, capable of putting an arrow through a wooden board at 100 yards. However, the Byzantines countered this with a triple threat of defense: the silk undergarment, the chainmail, and the overlapping steel lamellae. You see the arrows striking the horses, barding at an angle. Because the scales are rounded and angled slightly downward, the kinetic energy of the arrow is deflected rather than absorbed. It's like trying to shoot a fish that's covered in glass. Here's a quirky tidbit to further humiliate the enemy archers. Some Byzantine commanders encouraged their men to collect the arrows. There are accounts of cataphracts finishing a battle with dozens of arrows stuck in their thick felt horse blankets and padded over tunics, making them look like giant metallic porcupines. They would then ride back to camp, pull the arrows out, and hand them over to their own supply officers to be reused against the very people who fired them. It was the ultimate medieval return to sender policy. It broke the enemy spirit to see that their most lethal weapons were being treated as free refills for the imperial armory. Historians still argue whether the arrow-proofing of the horses was more important than the armor of the riders. A cataphract can fight with an arrow in his arm, but a horse with an arrow in its flank will likely throw its rider and ruin the formation. This is why the horse's metal protection had to be so comprehensive. You notice that even the horse's tail is sometimes enclosed in a leather tube or a light mail sleeve. Why? Because a horse archer's favorite trick was to ride past and shoot the horse in the soft rear. The Byzantines saw that coming and essentially turned the horse into a sealed box of iron. There is an open, scholarly debate regarding the point-blank effectiveness of the heavy Mongol-style bows that began to appear later. Some argue that at very close range, a heavy arrow could indeed find a weak spot in the lamellar lacing. But this is where the statue psychology comes back into play. Even if an arrow managed to pierce one layer, it still had to get through the leather backing, the mail, and the quilted cotton. You watch a rider shrug off a hit that would have killed a lesser man instantly. To the archer on the hill, these men aren't human. They are demons made of iron who eat arrows for breakfast. You notice how the riders keep their heads tucked slightly forward. This protects the neck gap where the helmet meets the breastplate. The horses, too, seem to know the drill, keeping their heads low so the prometopidion takes the hits. It is a collective, learned behavior of invincibility. You probably would unsurvive the mental toll of firing your entire quiver at a target and seeing it continue to trot toward you, unbothered, its metallic skin gleaming in the sun. It creates a sense of futility that causes enemy ranks to dissolve before the lances even arrive. The archer's nightmare wasn't just about the armor, it was about the range, because the horse was armored. The cataphract could afford to ignore the harassing fire that usually broke up a cavalry charge. They could wait until they were exactly where they wanted to be before committing to the push. You see a unit of Arab horse archers circling the wedge, emptying their quivers in a frantic Cantabrian circle. The cataphracts don't even break their stride. They are a hard counter to the most dominant weapon of the East. As the last few arrows of the volley fall short, the wedge reaches the archer's position. The hunters have become the hunted. You realize that the horse's metal protection changed the math of the battlefield. It turned the most effective long-range weapon of the age into a mere nuisance. As the cataphracts level their contoy for the final sweep, you can see the panic in the archer's eyes. They've realized too late that you can't kill a ghost with a bow, especially when that ghost is wearing 50 pounds of hardened Roman steel. As the intensity of the melee fades into the low groans of the wounded and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the weary, the focus of the army shifts to salvage and survival. You are entering the world of the camp surgeons, the medici, whose job it was to repair the damage that even the best steel couldn't fully prevent. If you were a soldier in any other medieval army, an arrow to the leg might mean a slow death from gangrene. But here, in the Byzantine medicine on the frontier, you have a fighting chance. You probably wouldn't survive the sight of the surgery tent. with its rows of bronze scalpels and the sharp antiseptic smell of boiled vinegar. But for the cataphract, this was a place of sophisticated hope. One mainstream historical fact about Byzantine military medicine is its incredible organization. Each bandana unit of about 300 to 400 men had its own medical corps, including deputado or stretcher bearers, who were paid a bounty for every wounded man they pulled from the field. You watch as a rider is helped from his horse, his arm sporting an arrow that has managed to wedge itself into a gap in his shoulder guard. The surgeon doesn't just rip it out. Following the texts of Paul of Aegina, he uses a specialized tool called the spoon of Diaquils, a bronze instrument designed to shroud the barbs of an arrowhead so it can be extracted without tearing the surrounding muscle. Here's a quirky tidbit. The Byzantines didn't just care for the men. They had the world's first equine trauma centers because the cataphract horse was an irreplaceable imperial asset. The Hippiatroi horse doctors were highly respected specialists. They used a variety of poultices made from crushed leeks, honey, and wine to treat the puncture wounds on the horse's legs where the armor was thinnest. There are even records of them using horses' surgical needles to stitch up gashes in the animal's hide. You see a vet examining a horse's flank, carefully cleaning a scrape where a Bulgarian axe glanced off the metal barding. He treats the animal with a gentleness that suggests he's working on a family member, not a piece of equipment. Historians still argue about the effectiveness of their antiseptic methods. While they didn't understand germ theory, the Byzantine obsession with washing wounds with wine and seawater, which we now know are mildly antiseptic, saved thousands of lives. You notice a rider being given a cup of wine mixed with mandrake root and opium. It's the era's best attempt at anesthesia. As the surgeon works, the rider remains eerily still, his eyes fixed on the icon of St. George hanging from the tent pole. The silk undergarment we discussed earlier is doing its job. The surgeon pulls on the fabric, and the arrowhead pops out, neatly wrapped in the shimmering thread, leaving the wound remarkably clean. There is an open scholarly debate regarding the recovery rate of these elite troops. Given the high cost of their training, the empire went to extreme lengths to rehabilitate them. Some believe that the Byzantines had a system of light duty for recovering cataphracts, allowing them to train recruits while their wounds healed. This ensured that even a broken Iron Man still provided value to the state. You see a veteran with a scarred face helping a younger rider adjust his klibanion. The older man's presence is a testament to the fact that you can survive the Iron Tide if you have the right doctors behind you. You notice the surgeons are also checking for crush injuries. Even if the armor wasn't pierced, the blunt force of a mace or a falling horse could snap ribs or cause internal bleeding. The surgeons use a technique called palpation, feeling the body for the telltale signs of bone fragments. For the horses, they check the hooves for laminitis, a devastating inflammation caused by the extreme weight they carried during the charge. It is a reminder that the cataphract was a biological system under immense stress. The armor protected against the fast death of the blade, but it was the doctors who fought the slow death of the injury. As the sun sets, the medical tent is a hive of quiet, focused activity. The chink-chink of the smithy is replaced by the soft clink of bronze instruments. You realize that the horse's metal protection was only the first line of defense. The second line was this: the accumulated medical wisdom of the Greek and Roman worlds, preserved and practiced with clinical precision. The empire didn't just throw its men into a meat grinder, it treated them as precious, repairable components of a divine machine. The rider you saw earlier is now being bandaged in clean linen. He'll live to ride again. His horse, too, has been cleared for duty after a day of rest and a specialized mash of grain and herbs. You stand at the edge of the camp, watching the doctors wash their hands in a basin of vinegar. In this world of iron and blood, the surgeon's needle was just as important as the blacksmith's hammer. Without this frontier medicine, the cataphracts would have been a one-generation wonder. With it, they remained the terror of the world for half a millennium. As the camp quietens for the night, the clanking of steel is replaced by a low, rhythmic murmuring that drifts through the rows of tents. You follow the sound to a central pavilion, where a priest, or papas, is swinging a silver censer, the thick scent of frankincense cutting through the smell of horse sweat. This is faith in the Iron Cross. For a Byzantine cataphract, the armor was the physical shield, but their orthodox faith was the spiritual one. You probably would unsurvive the mental pressure of being a frontline tank without the absolute conviction that your soul was as well armored as your body. These men didn't just see themselves as soldiers. They were the Straciotai to Christoutha soldiers of Christ, defending the only true empire on Earth. One mainstream historical fact that illustrates this religious integration is the use of battle icons. Every regiment carried a sacred image, often of the Virgin Mary, the Theotokos, or St. George, into the heart of the fray. You see the riders approaching the icon now, touching their steel-clad fingers to the painted wood before they sleep. The church and the army were inseparable. The emperor was God's viceregent, and therefore, every charge of the cataphracts was a liturgical act. The very lances they carried were often blessed in a formal ceremony, turning a piece of ash wood and steel into a holy instrument of justice. Here, as a quirky tidbit, the Byzantines believed so strongly in the protective power of faith that they often inscribed prayers inside the armor where no one could see them. You might find a tiny cross engraved on the inside of a horse's prometopidion, or a psalm written on the leather straps of a klibanion. Historians have found pieces of armor where the lacing holes are arranged in the shape of a cross. It was a form of hidden magic, a way to ensure that even if the steel failed, the divine grace of the empire would hold the pieces together. You watch a rider tie a small silk pouch containing a contact, relic piece of cloth that had touched the tomb of a saint, to his horse's bridle. To him, that scrap of fabric is just as essential as the bronze bit. Historians still argue about whether the Byzantines viewed their wars as holy wars, in the same way the Crusaders did. While the term crusade is a Western invention, the Byzantine cataphract certainly believed that dying in defense of the empire was a shortcut to salvation. You notice the riders don't shout for glory or for gold. They shout "The cross conquers, Storos Nika." There is an open scholarly debate regarding a proposed canon by Emperor Nicephorus Phocas, who wanted to officially declare all fallen soldiers as martyrs. The church actually pushed back on this, fearing it would turn the army into a fanatical cult. But for the man inside the iron mask, the distinction was academic. He believed God was his co-pilot long before the phrase was a bumper sticker. You notice the rituals extend to the horses as well. Before a major campaign, the animals were often led past a priest who would sprinkle them with holy water. It's a surreal sight, a 1,000-pound war machine draped in lethal steel, standing patiently while a bearded man in black robes tosses water over its armored nose. It served a practical purpose. Tuit calmed the men. If the horse is blessed, the horse is safe. If the horse is safe, the rider is safe. In the high-stakes gamble of medieval combat, anything that lowered the collective blood pressure was a tactical advantage. The religious imagery was also a form of psychological warfare against their neighbors. When the Arab or Bulgarian armies looked across the field, they didn't just see cavalry, they saw a forest of crosses and icons. It sent a message: we are the chosen ones, and you are fighting against the divine order. You see the camp priest moving through the lines, hearing confessions by the light of a small oil lamp. For many of these men, this will be their last night on earth, and they meet it with a stoic, ironclad calm that comes only from a total lack of doubt. As the priest finishes his rounds, he makes the sign of the cross over the unit's standards. The silk banners, embroidered with the image of Christ's Pantocrator, flutter in the cool night breeze. You realize that the Iron Tide was fueled by a unique blend of sophisticated engineering and ancient mysticism. The horse's metal protection was the hardware, but the Iron Cross was the software that ran the entire system. Without the belief that they were fighting for the very hinge of the universe, the weight of the armor would have been too much for any man to bear. As you head back to your own tent, the low chant of the evening prayer follows you. The riders are finally asleep, their hands perhaps still resting on the pommels of their swords. Tomorrow, they will wake up, strap on their 100-pound burdens, and ride into the mouth of hell, convinced that an army of angels is riding just behind their shoulder. You stand under the vast, star-filled Anatolian sky and realize that, in Byzantium, the line between the physical and the spiritual was as thin as a silk thread and just as strong. The morning sun breaks over the horizon, and you feel a shift in the air. The Iron Tide is about to reach its absolute zenith. You are standing in the middle of the 10th century military renaissance, specifically the era of Nicephorus to Phocas. This is the White Death of the Saracens, the emperor who took the already formidable cataphract and turned him into something almost mythological. If you thought the armor we've seen so far was heavy, you haven't seen anything yet. You probably wouldn't survive a single minute under the weight of the Phocan standard. This is the era where the Byzantine cavalrymen became a human-shaped fortification. One mainstream historical fact about this period is the formalization of the cataphractoi as a distinct, heavy-impact strike force separate from the standard heavy cavalry. Nikephoros, a career soldier before he was an emperor, wrote the Praecepta Militaria, which mandated that the cataphract's horse should be armored, not just on the chest and head, but across the entire body, with felt and quilted cotton, often topped with a full skirt of scale. You see a veteran sergeant inspecting the new recruits. He's checking the klibanion of a rider, ensuring it has the extra layers of thick bovine leather that Nikephoros insisted upon to stop the increasingly powerful arrows coming out of the Abbasid Caliphate. Here, as a quirky tidbit, Nikephoros was so obsessed with the invincibility of his iron men that he reportedly ordered his personal guard to practice charging through thickets of dry brush and even small trees to prove that their armor made them immune to the environment. He wanted them to be all-terrain tanks. There are rumors that he even experimented with fire-resistant equine barding, soaking the horse's felt blankets in a chemical solution, possibly alum, to protect them from the terrifying Greek fire that was sometimes used in land battles. You watch as a rider passes through a cloud of campfire smoke, his metal-clad horse barely flinching, a living testament to this era's obsession with total environmental dominance. Historians still argue whether Nikephoros' focus was a tactical genius or a religious fanatic whose military spending eventually bled the empire dry. He essentially turned the entire Byzantine economy into a furnace for forging cataphract gear. You see the result of that spending in the quality of the steel. This isn't the rusted, mismatched kit of a frontier levy. This is state-sponsored perfection. Every buckle is bronze, every strap is triple-stitched, and every horse is a prime specimen from the imperial stables. There is an open, scholarly debate regarding his wedge formations. Some suggest he actually advocated for a deeper, more narrow drill bit style that was designed to pierce an enemy line and then expand from the inside out, like a blooming flower of steel. You notice the riders are now wearing the epilarikion, that thick, padded surcotover, their metal armor. Under the Phocon reforms, this wasn't optional. It was part of a defensive for the human body. The padding caught the arrow, the lamellar stopped the point, the mail distributed the force, and the silk undertunic prevented the infection. It's a four-stage security system. You watch a rider hoist himself into the saddle. He looks twice as wide as a normal man. He is a walking mountain of textile and iron. The horses in this era are the true marvels. You see a Nicean stallion draped in a double layer of protection, a heavy felt housing covered by a second layer of iron scales. This horse is carrying roughly 120 pounds of armor alone, plus the 250 pounds heavy rider. It's an incredible feat of bioengineering. To sustain this, the Phocon reforms also overhauled the supply chain, ensuring that these super heavy units had first priority on all grain and water. You realize that you're looking at the absolute peak of the curve. Any heavier, and the horse's legs would snap. Any lighter, and the White Death would lose its psychological edge. As the units begin their morning maneuvers, the ground literally shakes. This isn't just a troop of soldiers, it's the physical manifestation of an empire that has decided it will no longer hide behind its walls. Nikephoros' focus took the cataphract and made it the tool of the Reconquista, reclaiming Crete, Cilicia, and parts of Syria. You see the confidence in the riders' posture. They know they are the apex predators of the medieval world. They aren't just defending the god-guarded city, they are the hammer that is bringing the world back under Roman law. As the sun glints off a sea of polished Phocon-era helmets, you realize that this was the moment the Iron Tide became a legend that would last for 1,000 years. It was a perfect, brief alignment of imperial wealth, metallurgical skill, and the iron will of a soldier emperor. You stand in the wake of the passing column, the dust settling on your boots, and you know that for a brief window in the 10th century, these men and their armored horses were the closest thing the world had ever seen to an unstoppable force. The golden age of the Phocon reforms feels like a distant memory as you stand on the windswept ridges near the fortress of Manzikert. It is the year 1071, and the air is heavy with the scent of ozone and parched grass. You are witnessing the Battle of Manzikert's shadow, the moment the Iron Tide finally met its match in the shifting, elusive tactics of the Seljuk Turks. You probably wouldn't survive the creeping realization that your invincible armor, designed to crush standing armies, is becoming a liability against a foe that refuses to stand still. You watch a line of cataphracts trot forward. their horses still draped in the heavy metal skirts of the previous century, but their eyes tell a story of mounting frustration. One mainstream historical fact about this period is the decline in the quality of the imperial horses. The Seljuks had begun to seize the Anatolian plateau, the literal engine room of the Byzantine cavalry. Without the vast horse farms of the interior, the empire was forced to rely on inferior breeds or expensive imports. You see a cataphract mount that looks slightly too small for its burden. Its knees are trembling under the weight of the iron barding. This was the structural fatigue of the empire. The armor was still thick, but the living foundation beneath it was beginning to crack. Here's a quirky tidbit. During the chaos of the Manzikert campaign, some cataphracts reportedly began to strip away their horses' side armor, the paraparidia, in a desperate bid for speed. It was a complete reversal of 300 years of military doctrine. They were literally peeling the tank to try and catch the light Turkish horse archers who would ride in, fire a volley, and vanish before the heavy cantos could be leveled. Historians still argue whether the Byzantine defeat was a failure of the armor itself or a failure of the eyes and ears of the army. When the light scouts failed, the cataphracts became blind giants, wandering the field in search of a target that wasn't there. There is an open scholarly debate regarding the betrayal of the rearguard. While the cataphracts in the center were holding their ground as they always did, the political divisions in the capital meant that the support units simply turned and left the field. You see the horror on a rider's face as he looks back to find the infantry support has vanished. Now, the Iron Tide is an island. The Turks don't even try to pierce the armor. They simply ride in circles, firing at the horses' eyes and the riders' necks until the giants collapse from sheer exhaustion. You realize that the horse's metal protection only works if someone is guarding your back. You notice the riders are sweating more than usual, their armor caked in a fine gray dust that makes them look like ghosts. This is the Manzikert shadow, the psychological realization that the empire is no longer the predator. The Turks are using a tactic called the feigned retreat, and the cataphracts, desperate for a decisive blow, are falling for it. They charge their horses, armor clanking and grinding, but they are chasing the wind. For every mile they gallop in that heavy gear, they are shortening their horses' lives by years. One quirky fringe tidbit suggests that the Emperor Romanos Diogenes, who led the charge, was actually hampered by his own magnificent equine barding. When his horse was eventually shot from under him, hid in the one spot the armor did uncover, the weight of his own klibanion made it impossible for him to mount a fresh horse quickly. He was captured because he was too well protected to be agile. It is a stinging irony. The very thing designed to keep the emperor safe made him a prisoner. As the sun sets on that disastrous day, you see the remnants of the onset-proud units wandering the field. The Iron Tide has been broken, not by a stronger metal, but by a faster one. You realize that the Byzantine cataphract was a creature of a specific ecosystem, an ecosystem of wealth, stable frontiers, and predictable enemies. When the world changed, the armor became a prison. The Seljuk victory didn't just take land, it took the myth of invincibility that the armor had carefully cultivated for centuries. As you watch the Turkish riders move like shadows through the cooling twilight, you feel the weight of the era ending. The Byzantine cataphract would survive for a few more centuries, but it would never again be the undisputed master of the world. The shadow of Manzikert is the shadow of a giant that has been outrun. You stand in the silence of the aftermath, the distant jingling of Turkish bridles mocking the heavy, silent iron of the fallen, and you understand that in the game of war, sometimes the heaviest shield is the easiest one to circumvent. The battlefield of the late 11th and 12th centuries is no longer the exclusive playground of the Iron Men of the East. As you survey the shifting landscape of military power, you witness a fascinating meeting of giants, the rivals in heavy armor. To your left, the familiar scale-clad Byzantine cataphract, a relic of 1,000 years of Roman engineering. To your right, emerging from the damp forests and stone keeps of the west, the Frankish or Norman knight. And on the horizon, the terrifying lightspeed swarms of Mongol and Turkish horse archers. You probably wouldn't survive the collision of these three distinct philosophies of war. It's a moment where the perfected Byzantine tank is forced to justify its existence against younger, more aggressive competitors. One mainstream historical fact about this era is the lance revolution of the Western knights. While the Byzantine cataphract used his cantos with a two-handed grip or a stabilized thrust, the Western knight had perfected the couched lance. tucked firmly under the armpit and braced against a high-backed saddle. This turned the rider and the horse into a single, rigid kinetic bolt. You see a Byzantine officer watching a group of Frankish mercenaries practice. He looks skeptical, but there's a flicker of worry in his eyes. The Westerners, Dan T, have the sophisticated equine barding of the Byzantines. Their horses are often naked or covered only in simple cloth butt. Their charge is faster, more violent, and carries a raw, explosive energy that the methodical Byzantine trot lacks. Here, as a quirky tidbit, the Byzantines were so impressed and annoyed by the Western knights that they began to mix and match their equipment. You see a cataphract who has traded his traditional round shield for a kite shield, that long teardrop-shaped defense developed by the Normans to protect the rider's entire left side and leg. Historians still argue whether the Byzantines were westernizing or if they were simply doing what they had always done, stealing the best tech from their neighbors. However, the one thing the Byzantines refused to give up was the horse armor. To a Roman mind, the Western knight's habit of riding an unarmored horse into a shower of arrows was nothing short of suicidal madness. On the other side of the spectrum are the Mongols. You see a scout in the distance, a man who wears only hardened silk and leather, riding a pony that looks like a shaggy toy compared to the Byzantine Nizian chargers. But that pony is fast, and that rider can hit a bird's eye at 100 paces while at a full gallop. This is the cataphract's true nightmare. The Mongol doesn't want to joust. He wants to turn the cataphract into a heavy, overheated statue. There is an open scholarly debate about why the Byzantines never successfully adopted the lighter, more flexible tactics of the Mongols. Perhaps the weight of tradition was as heavy as the klibanion itself. The empire was a civilization of walls, and the cataphract was simply a wall that could move. You notice the cultural friction in the camp. The Byzantine cataphracts view the Western knights as unwashed barbarians who happen to be good at charging, while the Westerners view the cataphracts as effeminate because they use bows and cover their horses in fancy metal scales. One quirky fringe tidbit involves a 12th century chronicler who claimed that a Byzantine horse in full barding was so slow that a Western knight could ride circles around it, but so well protected that the knight's sword would shatter before it found a gap. It was the classic unstoppable force meets immovable object scenario played out in the dirt of the Levant. The horse armor remains the great divider. You see a Frankish knight staring at a Byzantine peristithidion, the horse's chestplate, with a mix of awe and confusion. He doesn't understand the logistics required to keep that metal from rusting, or the horse from collapsing. To him, the horse is a disposable tool of glory. To the Byzantine, the horse is a precious imperial asset. This difference in value is why the cataphract stayed heavy while the rest of the world was experimenting with speed. The Byzantines were trying to preserve an empire. The others were just trying to win a battle. There's an open scholarly debate regarding the Battle of the Dyrrhachium, where the Norman knights actually managed to break a Byzantine line. Some say it proved the superiority of the Western charge, while others point out that the Byzantine cataphracts were understrength and poorly led. You watch the riders of the Iron Tide tightening their girths, their faces set in grim masks. They are the last of the ancients, surrounded by a world that is becoming increasingly medieval. They are holding onto their ironclad horses as if the metal itself could stop the passage of time. As the sun sets, casting long shadows of the different riders across the plain, you realize that the cataphract is a beautiful, doomed hybrid. It has the heavy armor of the past, but faces the high-velocity threats of the future. The rivals in heavy armor aren't just fighting for territory. They are fighting to see which philosophy of warfare will survive the coming centuries. And as you look at the intricate, overlapping scales of the Byzantine horse, you can't help but feel that you re-looking at a masterpiece that is simply too expensive for the world it lives in. The air in the stables of Constantinople is no longer thick with the scent of fresh oil and high-grade barley. Instead, it carries the sharp temps of neglect and the stale smell of old dust. You are walking through the twilight of an empire, witnessing the slow decay of the empire during the 13th and 14th centuries. The Iron Tide is no longer a roaring ocean. It has become a series of shallow, stagnant pools. You probably wouldn't survive the heartbreak of seeing these on-Semite units reduced to a shadow of their former glory there. Horses lean and rib-sprung, and their armor held together with frayed hemp rope instead of silk and high-quality leather. The horse's metal protection once the pride of the Mediterranean, has become an unsustainable luxury. One mainstream historical fact about this period of decline is the catastrophic loss of the imperial tax base. After the Fourth Crusade in 1204, the empire was shattered into successor states, and even after the recovery of Constantinople in 1261, the treasury was perpetually empty. You see a cataphract if, you can still call him, that polishing a breastplate that is pitted with deep, unrepairable rust. The state-of-ruin horse farms, the matata, are gone, seized by the Turks or the Latins. Now, the riders have to provide their own mounts, and without the imperial subsidies, they simply cannot afford the massive, powerful chargers needed to carry a full set of barding. Here, a quirky tidbit. The decline was so severe that some chroniclers noted Byzantine heavy cavalrymen riding into battle with barding made of nothing but hardened felt or even wickerwork. It was a theater of armor. They wanted to maintain the psychological statue effect we discussed earlier, but the metal was gone, sold to pay Venetian debts or melted down to coin desperate, debased currency. Historians still argue whether the disappearance of the cataphract was a tactical choice or a purely economic one. When you can no longer afford the iron for the horse's headplate, you stop pretending you can lead a heavy wedge charge. You watch a rider tighten a girth made of cheap, coarse wool. The horse flinches, it's hide sensitive from malnutrition. There is an open scholarly debate regarding the late Byzantine military's effectiveness. Some argue that by shedding the heavy armor, the Byzantines finally became as mobile as their Turkish enemies. However, most agree that without the crushed depth of the armored wedge, the Byzantines lost their only unique advantage. They became just another second-rate Balkan power, unable to hold the line against the rising Ottoman tide. You see the iron tide becoming a paper tide. The manuals of Leo VI are still read, but they describe a world that no longer exists, a world where the empire could afford to spend a village's yearly income on a single horse's chess piece. You notice the cultural decay as well. The riders no longer carry themselves with the stoic, divine confidence of the Phocan era. They look like men who know they are playing a losing hand. One quirky fringe tidbit suggests that during the final siege of Constantinople in 1453, there were only a handful of truly cataphractal riders left. They were essentially antiquesmen, wearing family heirlooms that were 300 years old, riding horses that would have been rejected by the inspectors of the 10th century. It is a tragic image, the last of the Romans, encased in the crumbling steel of their ancestors, waiting for the end. The horse armor is the first thing to be abandoned. It's too heavy for the smaller, weaker horses, and too expensive to maintain in a world where the smiths have all moved to the Ottoman camp. You see a pile of discarded paraperidia, the horse's side scales, sitting in a corner of the armory, being sold for scrap. The horse's metal protection has been defeated by the simplest weapon of all: poverty. Without the complex logistical tale of the Teuton, the cataphract is just a man on a horse who is too tired to fight. There is an open scholarly debate about whether the pronoyer system, the Byzantine version of feudalism, was to blame. By giving land to individual soldiers instead of paying them from the central treasury, the emperor lost control over the quality of the equipment. If a soldier had a bad harvest, his horse went without barding. If he had 2 bad harvests, he went without a horse. You realize that the iron tide was a creature of the state. When the state withered, the iron fell away like dead skin. As the sun sets over the crumbling Theodosian walls, you see a lone rider patrolling the perimeter. He has a helmet and a breastplate, but his horse is bare, its coat dull in the fading light. The era of the iron duo is over. The horse's metal protection, that shimmering wall of scale that once turned back the arrows of a dozen nations, is now just a memory kept alive in the dusty pages of forgotten books. You stand in the silence of the dying city and realize that the most expensive armor in the world is useless if you can no longer afford the spirit to wear it. The dust has finally settled over the ruins of the god-guarded city, and the rhythmic thrum of the armored hooves has faded into the absolute silence of history. You are standing in the middle of a ghost story. As you look out over the modern landscape where the great battles once raged, you are witnessing the ghostly echoes of iron. The Byzantine cataphract, the man who is more metal than flesh, and the horse that was a mirror of his master is gone. But the impression they left on the world is as deep as a hoofprint in wet clay. You probably wouldn't survive the haunting weight of this realization that an entire way of life, an entire philosophy of total protection, could vanish, leaving behind only the shimmering memory of the Iron Tide. One mainstream historical fact about the end of the Cataphracts is their lasting influence on the very people who defeated them. The Ottoman Turks, though they favored light cavalry, eventually adopted heavy barding for their own elite Sipahi units, carrying the Byzantine tradition of the armored horse into the age of gunpowder. You see the legacy in the way the Ottomans organized their military workshops. They copied the Byzantine military-industrial complex, almost point for point. The iron didn't disappear, it just changed its heraldry, even as the empire fell in 1453. The concept of the heavy shock trooper was being exported to the West, influencing the final massive plottermore suits of the Latemedieval Knight. Here's a quirky tidbit. To this day, archaeologists occasionally find scale clusters in the fields of Turkey and the Balkans, clumps of rusted iron where the silk and leather have long since rotted away, but the metal plates remain fused together in the shape of a horse as chest or a rider as thigh. They are like iron fossils. Historians still argue whether the Byzantine Iron Man was a success or a failure. If an empire survives for over 1,000 years, can you really call its primary weapon a failure? Or was the cataphract a brilliant, expensive adaptation that eventually outlived the environment it was designed to protect? You watch a modern farmer pull a piece of rusted steel from his plow. He doesn't know it's a 10th century lamella, a single scale from the White Death of Nicephorus Phocas. There is an open scholarly debate regarding the romance of the cataphract. In the West, we have the Arthurian knight, but in the East, the acritic songs tell of lone riders on armored horses patrolling the edges of the world. These were the super soldiers of their day, the peak of what human engineering could achieve before the invention of the engine. You realize that the horse's metal protection was the ultimate symbol of Byzantine civilization. It was redundant. It was incredibly expensive. It was rooted in the past, and it was breathtakingly beautiful to look at. It was a civilization that refused to simplify, choosing instead to layer protection upon protection until the weight itself became the thing that defined them. You notice that even now, the image of the cataphract persists in our collective imagination. When we think of heavy cavalry, our minds go to the knight. But the knight was just a younger cousin to the faceless iron statues of Constantinople. The cataphract was the original tank, a system of survival that prioritized the preservation of the soldier above all else. You probably would unsurvive the transition back to our modern world without a lingering sense of awe for these men. They were the bridge between the ancient world of the legion and the medieval world of the knight, a shimmering metallic bridge that held the line for a millennium. As you take a final look at the iron duo in your mind, S.I. the rider in his silken steel, the horse in its mask and skirts, you see them finally trot into the mist of the past. They aren't fighting anymore. The heat is gone, the rust is gone, and the weight is gone. They have become part of the landscape, a ghostly line of silver on the horizon of human memory. You realize that the answer to why they wore so much armor is simple: because they loved their city. They feared their god, and they were the only thing standing between their world and the void. The world is quiet now. The fires of the camp have long since burned down to white ash, and the heavy jingling of the barding has softened into a rhythmic, distant pulse that matches the steady beat of your own heart. You can feel the coolness of the evening air settling over you, a gentle relief from the phantom heat of the Anatolian sun. As the iron masks are finally lifted and the weight of the steel is set aside, the horses, those great, noble mountains of muscle, are finally unburdened. Their skin twitching in the soft breeze as they graze on the eternal grasses of the plateau. There is no more need for the lance, no more need for the skirt of steel, and the formidable shadows of the cantos have stretched and faded into the deep velvet purple of a Roman night. You are safe now, tucked away from the arrows and the dust, wrapped in the softest silk of the mind as the journey comes to its natural rest. The empire is at peace, the borders are secure, and the iron tide has finally reached the shore of a quiet, dreamless sleep. Let the images of the shimmering scales and the steady metallic trot fade into the background hum of the world, like the soft turning of a vellum page in a library that never sleeps. The story is told, the history is written, and the giants are finally at rest. You breathe slowly, deeply, as the heavy layers of the world fall away, leaving you light, protected, and perfectly still. The journey is over.